A dying river. A forged legacy. A conspiracy buried beneath years of silence. Bent River. Chapter 1. The drought had been at the country since April, and by August it had stopped being a condition and had become the country itself. Not something happening to the land, but something the land had decided to be. The grass gone the color of old ash, and the creek beds showing their gravel, and the sky each morning coming up the same hard, cloudless blue that offered nothing and kept its promise. Eldridge rode south from Dodge into it on a Tuesday with the federal warrant in his coat pocket, and the roan moving through the heat with the stoic, load-bearing patience of an animal that had been through enough Kansas summers to have stopped expecting them to be reasonable. The land changed south of the Arkansas. North of it, the country had been settled long enough to have acquired the specific character of settled country: fences, roads with names, the visible evidence of human intention imposed on the ground over time. South of it, the intention thinned and then gave out entirely, and what replaced it was the older character of the strip country, the no-man's land between Kansas and Texas that belonged jurisdictionally to no state and practically to whoever had the stubbornness to stay in it. A flat, dry, enormous country that the drought had reduced to something that looked, in the midday heat shimmer, like the memory of a country rather than a country itself. He crossed the Cimarron at a ford that 2 months ago would have put water to his stirrups, and now put it to the roan's fetlocks, the river running thin and brown between banks of white gravel that showed how much river there was supposed to be and how little of it was currently showing up. He stopped and let the roan drink, and looked at the far bank, and looked at the water, and thought about a man who'd built a 2-year operation on the premise that this river and the rights to its water along the North Fork were worth killing for. In a drought like this one, in a strip of country like this one, the premise was not unreasonable. The Galt place sat 2 miles north of the Cimarron's North Fork, on a slight rise that gave it a view of the drainage in both directions, which Eldridge guessed was the original reason someone had built there. Not a dominant position in any military sense, but the specific vantage of a working rancher who wanted to see the water source from the house and know at a glance what the river was doing. What the river was doing, visible from the rise even at a mile, was nearly nothing. The house itself was a solid adobe structure with a covered porch running its full front length, a barn behind it in better repair than the house, and a windmill at the yard's east edge, turning slowly in a wind too light to be doing much good against the heat. The yard between the house and the barn was swept clean and hard-packed. Not the yard of a working operation in difficulty, but the yard of someone who decided that maintaining the appearance of order was a form of argument worth making. Eldridge pulled up at the gate, a real gate, iron-hinged, recently oiled, the one thing on the property that looked like it had been attended to that morning, and looked at the yard. A woman came out of the barn before he'd finished looking. She came with a purpose and a direction, not hurrying, but not accommodating his presence either. She was going somewhere specific, and he was between her and it, and she was going to address that fact in the most efficient available manner. She was perhaps 38, lean in the way of people who worked outdoors in drought summers without the luxury of losing condition, with a face that had been in the weather long enough to have stopped being pretty in the conventional sense and had arrived at something more accurate and more durable. She wore work clothes, canvas trousers, a shirt, boots that had been good once, and she carried in her right hand a ledger that she'd apparently been working with in the barn, which was not where most people worked with ledgers. She looked at Eldridge with the flat, assessing attention of someone who'd had a great many men ride up to this gate in the last 2 years and had learned to process them quickly and without false welcome. "Eldridge Sample," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Land office sent a wire 3 days ago." She looked at the roan. "Put your horse in the barn." It's too hot to leave an animal standing in the yard. She turned and went back to the barn without waiting to see if he'd follow, which he took as the correct measure of how the conversation was going to work. And he dismounted and led the roan through the gate and followed her. The barn was cooler than the yard by 10 degrees, adobe walls on the attached tack room holding the night's residual chill against the day's assault. And she'd been working at a workbench along the barn's south wall, which explained the ledger. The workbench held a lamp, the ledger, a stack of papers held down at one corner by a horseshoe, and a coffee pot on a small iron stand that was still warm from a morning fire now burned down to ash. She poured 2 cups without asking, and handed him one, and sat on the workbench stool and opened the ledger to a page marked with a strip of leather and set it on the bench in front of her. "Before you tell me what the warrant covers," she said, "I want to show you what I've got. Because the warrant covers fraud, and what I've got covers fraud and 3 dead men, and I want you to know the difference between what you came for and what's actually here before you decide how to work it." Eldridge looked at the ledger. "Go ahead." She went through it, the way she'd clearly gone through it many times before him, without hesitation, in the organized sequence of a person who'd built the account from raw material and knew exactly where each piece came from and what it connected to. Deed records, copied in her own hand from the county recorder in Liberal, tracking the transfer of 3 neighboring ranch properties from their original owners to Reuben Calhoun's holding company across an 18-month window. Water rights filings from the Federal Land Office, 4 of them, each one predating the death of the rancher whose property the rights had been attached to by a period of between 3 weeks and 2 months. A timeline she'd constructed herself in pencil, on a sheet of foolscap, that laid the sequence out in the flat, unadorned manner of someone who understood that the sequence itself was the argument and didn't need dressing up. "Orrin drowned in June of '81, she said. "The Cimarron North Fork, at the bend below the old cottonwood. He'd swum that bend since he was 12 years old." She said this without heat. She'd had 2 years to burn the heat out of it, and what was left was something cooler and more durable. August Pounder died of snakebite in August of '81, 2 months after Orrin, in a pasture he'd worked since '67. Len Foss died of a fall from his horse in November, same year, on a road he'd ridden 5 days a week for 20 years. She looked at the timeline. 3 ranchers. 6 months. All 3 owned water rights on the Cimarron North Fork. All 3 died in ways a coroner could call accident, and a county inquest would accept without much deliberation. She looked at Eldridge. All 3 properties transferred to Calhoun inside of 8 months after each death. Eldridge held his coffee and looked at the timeline. "The water rights filings," he said. "The ones predating the deaths. Filed in Liberal at the county recorder's office," she said. "I've looked at the filed copies. They're clean on the face of them, right dates, right signatures, right descriptions." She paused. "But Orrin signed our water rights over to me when we married. Not to a holding company, and not to Reuben Calhoun. To me, Desagalt, in my name, because Orrin believed a woman ought to hold something in her own name in a country where things could change without warning." She looked at Eldridge steadily. "The filing that predates Orrin's death shows his signature on a transfer to Calhoun's company 2 weeks before he drowned. I have every letter Orrin wrote in the last year of his life. I have receipts for every transaction he made. He was not a man who did things without telling me, and he did not tell me about this, and I don't believe he did it." "Forgery," Eldridge said. "That's what I believe," she said. "I can't prove it from the filed copies, because the filed copies are what they are, filed and recorded. The originals would show it if they've been altered, and the originals are not in the county recorder's office. The recorder keeps copies. The originals go back to the filer." She closed the ledger. Calhoun has the originals. Eldridge drank his coffee. It was not good coffee. The drought had something to do with the water quality in this part of the strip, a mineral flatness that the boiling didn't entirely address, but it was hot, and she'd offered it without fuss, and he drank it in the spirit it had been offered. "You've been building this for 2 years," he said. "Since the week after Orrin died," she said. "I knew what it was before the inquest finished. I knew it the same way I know everything I know about this operation, from looking at it straight and not letting what I want to be true interfere with what is true." She picked up the horseshoe from the corner of her papers and turned it in her hands, not fidgeting, just something to do while she said what she said next. "I sent what I had to the county sheriff in Liberal 8 months ago. He thanked me politely. I sent it to the U.S. Marshal's office in Dodge 7 months ago. I got a form letter. I sent it to the Federal Land Office 6 months ago, and I got a warrant application form back, which I completed and returned, and which I gather eventually produced the warrant you're carrying." She set the horseshoe down. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty about how long it took. I'm telling you so you understand what you're walking into, which is a situation that has had 2 years to get organized and well lawyered, and which the man at the center of it has had 2 years to prepare for a visit from exactly the kind of visitor you are." "Priscilla Dace," Eldridge said. He'd read the name in the land office files in Dodge. His lawyer. "She rode out from Liberal the day after my wire to the land office was apparently noticed," Desagault said. "Which means someone in the land office told Calhoun the wire was coming or had come, and Calhoun sent for his lawyer before the warrant was issued." She looked at Eldridge. "He's been waiting for you. I want you to understand that clearly. The man you're going after has known you were coming since before you left Dodge City." Eldridge put his cup down on the workbench. He looked at the timeline on the foolscap, at the 3 dates and the 3 deaths, and the 8-month window of property transfers, and he looked at Desagault's face, which had in it the specific quality of a person who had been right about something important for 2 years and had spent those 2 years being treated with the particular condescension reserved for people who were right about important things before the important people were ready to hear it. "The attempt on you," he said. "The warrant application mentioned 1 March," he said. "Someone cut the support on the windmill tower. Not all the way through, enough that the next strong wind would finish it. We get strong winds in the spring. I found the cut when I was painting the tower in February, and I climbed down and stood in the yard and looked at it and understood what it was." She looked at the barn wall. "I've been sleeping in the barn since February. Closer to the horses, harder to approach without being heard. I moved the lamp in here, and the workbench, and the good coffee, and I've been running the operation from in here ever since." She paused. "The house looks lived in from the road. I make sure of that." Eldridge looked at the barn with new attention, at the bedroll he'd noticed and half-registered on a shelf near the tack room, at the lamp and the organized papers and the horseshoe holding them down, at the coffee pot on its small iron stand. She'd turned her barn into a defensible position. She'd been sleeping in it for 6 months, while she waited for the Federal Land Office to process a warrant application and send someone south. "All right," Eldridge said. He looked at the foolscap timeline, then at her. "I'll need a copy of everything in that ledger. And I'll need you to ride with me tomorrow to show me the water sources, the specific places on the North Fork where the rights attach." She looked at him. "You're not going to Calhoun's place first?" "No," Eldridge said. "I'm going to understand the land first. A man who's built 2 years of patient preparation around a piece of country deserves a bounty man who understands that country before he walks into the preparation. Something shifted in Desagalt's face. Not relief exactly, more the specific expression of someone who has been told the right thing by the right person, after a long time of being told insufficient things by insufficient people. "Supper's in the barn at 6, she said. "You'll sleep in the tack room. The second horse in the far stall is a kicker. Don't go in there without telling me first." She opened her ledger again and went back to work, which Eldridge took as the correct signal that the opening conversation had ended and the actual work had begun. And he went to settle the roan. Outside, the windmill turned its slow, insufficient circle in the dry afternoon air, and the Cimarron ran its thin brown thread along the floor of the drainage 2 miles south. And somewhere past it, on the South Fork, Reuben Calhoun sat in whatever his waiting looked like, and had been sitting in it for 2 years and would continue sitting in it until something came that changed the calculation. Eldridge unsaddled the roan and hung the tack and forked hay into the stall, and stood a moment with his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the heat still in her coat from the ride south, and thought about a man who used patience as a weapon meeting a woman who turned her own barn into a fort. He was a long way from being the most prepared person in this particular situation. The roan put her nose in the hay and ate. Chapter 2. They rode out before first light. Desagalt's idea, not Eldridge's, and the right idea. The North Fork drainage in the pre-dawn was 10 degrees cooler than it would be by 8 o'clock, and the ground read better in the low, raking light of early morning than it did under the flat, shadowless glare that the drought sky produced by mid-morning, and maintained without variation until dark. She knew this because she'd been riding this drainage for 11 years, since before she married Orrin, since the year she'd come out from eastern Kansas with her brother's outfit, and decided, at 27, that the strip country was where she intended to stay, a decision that had surprised everyone who knew her, and that she'd never reconsidered. She rode a compact bay gelding with the same direct, purposeful quality she brought to everything else, and she carried in her saddlebag a hand-drawn map of the North Fork's water rights parcels that she'd made herself from the legal descriptions in the county records, which was a more accurate map than any the land office had produced because it had been drawn by someone who'd ridden every foot of the ground it depicted. They crossed onto the Cimarron's north bank, at the same ford Eldridge had used coming south, and she turned them east without discussion, along the bank, into the first gray light coming up over the flat country ahead. "The rights run in sections," she said, riding. Each ranch had a specific stretch of bank attached to the original homestead filing, a continuous section of river frontage that gave the ranch its water access. You lose the river frontage, you lose the ranch. It's that simple in a drought year, and in a normal year it's only slightly less simple. She pointed at the near bank. "This stretch here is ours. Was ours. Still is, legally, because I haven't signed anything, and nobody's produced a document that says I have." "Calhoun hasn't moved on your rights directly," Eldridge said. "Not yet," she said. "Because I'm still here, and still alive, and he can't produce a document with my name on it, as long as I'm available to deny it." She looked at the river. The 3 men who died, Orrin, August Pounder, Len Foss, all 3 died without leaving anyone behind who had the standing or the resources to contest what happened to their rights afterward. Orrin's sister is in Ohio and doesn't know a water rights filing from a grocery receipt. Cleo Pounder is 71, and August left her with nothing but the land, which she sold to Calhoun 6 months after he died, because she had no other way to eat. Len Foss had a son, Wiley, 24, who was working a ranch in the Texas Panhandle when his father died, and came home to find the property already in probate and the water rights already transferred. "Wiley Foss works for Calhoun now," Eldridge said. She glanced at him. "You know that already." Land Office files, Eldridge said. His name appears in a deposition Calhoun filed contesting the warrant application. Listed as a current employee. Calhoun hired him 8 months ago, Dessa said. Wiley needed work. The ranch was gone. There wasn't anything else in the strip that paid. She rode for a moment. I don't think Wiley's a bad man. I think he's a young man in an impossible position who's made the best calculation he could with what he had, which is a calculation I don't entirely fault him for, even if I think it costs him something he doesn't fully account for. You've talked to him. Twice, she said. He comes to the North Bank sometimes in the evenings, after his work's done, and sits by the river. I've seen him there from the rise. Once I rode down and talked to him, and once I didn't. She paused. The time I didn't, I'd seen the way he was sitting, and decided he needed the river more than he needed conversation. Eldridge filed this without comment, and looked at the river alongside them. The thin brown current, the white gravel bars exposed on both banks, the exposed root systems of the cottonwoods along the bank's edge where the water table had dropped below them and left them holding onto ground rather than water. The trees weren't dead yet. They had reserves. But they were working through them. Show me the Pounder boundary, he said. The Pounder section started a mile east of the Galt boundary, separated by a stretch of bank that had been federal land in the original homestead filings, and that Calhoun had acquired through a separate process. A straightforward federal land purchase that was entirely legitimate and that Dessa acknowledged as such without being asked, which Eldridge noted as a quality worth noting. She didn't shade the picture to make her case stronger than it was. The Pounder boundary was marked by an iron post driven into the bank's edge, the post listing slightly toward the water in the way of things anchored in soil that the river had been undercutting for years. The post had a surveyor's cap on it, old, weathered to the color of the gravel around it. Someone had scratched P into the cap with a knife point at some point in the past, a small private notation that Eldridge looked at for a moment before looking at the land around it. Where was August Pounder found, he said. Dessa turned the base south, away from the river, into the graded pasture ground above the bank. 300 yards in, she stopped. Here, she said. It was an ordinary piece of ground. Dry grass, a scatter of low prickly pear along a slight depression, the remains of what had been a cattle trail through the grass worn to bare dirt. Eldridge got down and walked the area in the slow, expanding circle he used on ground he was reading, not expecting to find anything 2 years old in drought-hardened earth that had been rained on and dried out and rained on and dried out a dozen times since, but reading it anyway because reading it was what you did before you had a right to say there was nothing to read. He found nothing useful in the ground. What he found instead was the prickly pear. The prickly pear along the depression's edge was old growth, established, multi-padded, the kind that took years to reach the spread these plants had reached. A man who'd worked this pasture for 14 years, as Dessa had said August Pounder had, would have known exactly where every stand of prickly pear was, because a man who worked cattle in prickly pear country cataloged it the way a sailor cataloged rocks, not consciously as a daily exercise, but so thoroughly over time that the knowledge was structural, part of how he moved through the ground rather than something he thought about while moving through it. Eldridge stood beside the largest stand, and looked at it, and thought about a man who watched the ground when he walked, because he'd been bitten once before, found dead of snakebite 2 yards from a stand of prickly pear he'd been walking around for 14 years. He didn't know yet what that meant exactly. He wrote it in his small book, and went back to the roan. "What are you writing?" Dessa said. "A question," he said. "I don't have the answer yet." She accepted this without pushing it, which continued to characterize everything about how she handled information she didn't have yet. She held the space open without filling it, which was a rarer quality than people understood. The Foss section was another mile east, and the boundary there was a cedar post rather than an iron one. The post in better condition because it was newer, replaced at some point in the last decade by a man or a ranch hand who'd had the materials and the afternoon. The land above the bank on the Foss section had a different character than the Pounder land, more broken, cut through with the dry channels of seasonal draws that ran hard in spring and sat empty the rest of the year. Good cattle country in a normal year, because the draws caught and held moisture longer than the flat ground. Marginal country in a drought year because when they dried completely. Len Foss's horse was found here, Dessa said. She'd stopped on the road above the section, looking down at it. The horse came back to the barn on its own. Len was found a mile south, on the section road. He was riding north, Eldridge said. Toward the river. That's what the inquest said, she said. He'd been to Calhoun's place. That much was established. He'd ridden down to the South Fork to discuss a grazing lease on land that ran between the two properties. He was coming home when the horse threw him. Calhoun confirmed the meeting. Calhoun confirmed it. Said Len had ridden out in good health and good spirits. She looked at the section road below them. November is not good throwing weather. The ground's firm, the flies are gone. A horse that's made that road 100 times doesn't suddenly develop opinions about it. She paused. But horses throw riders. It happens. And a thrown man who lands badly on a firm November road dies in a way that looks exactly like a thrown man who lands badly on a firm November road. Medical examiner, Eldridge said. Liberal doesn't have a medical examiner, she said. The coroner is the funeral parlor man, who is a decent enough person, and completely unqualified to distinguish between the kind of head injury a road makes and the kind of head injury something else makes, and who said road and was probably right and might have been wrong. Eldridge looked at the section road. He looked at the distance between it and the Cimarron, and he thought about a man riding home from a meeting with the man who would acquire his property 6 weeks after his death. And he thought about the specific window between Len Foss leaving the South Fork and Len Foss's horse arriving home without him, riderless, and what a mile of section road held in that window. He wrote in his small book. Dessa watched him write without asking what he was writing this time. They were 2 miles further east, at the eastern boundary of the Foss section where it met another stretch of federal land, when she stopped the bay and pointed south across the Cimarron. That's Calhoun's main ranch, she said. Eldridge looked. It sat on the South Fork's high ground, a mile and a half from where they were standing, visible in the drought-cleared air with the specific clarity that low humidity produced, every detail sharp, every building distinct, the whole operation readable at distance the way an honest account was readable. A substantial ranch house in adobe and frame, larger than anything on the north bank. Barns, 2 of them, one large, one smaller, both in evident good repair. Corrals with horses. A bunkhouse. A second building that might have been a foreman's house or a storage facility. And further back, just visible on the South Fork's near bank, the infrastructure of a water operation. A pump house, pipe runs visible as thin lines in the dry ground. The evidence of someone who had been serious about controlling water access long before the drought made water access the single most valuable thing in this part of the strip. He built the pump house 2 years ago, Dessa said. Before the drought, when the river was still running full. Before Orrin died. She looked at the South Fork operation steadily. He was planning this before he started executing it. He built the water infrastructure first, and then acquired the water rights, and the acquiring required the men who held them to stop holding them. Eldridge looked at the pump house. He looked at the pipe runs. He looked at the whole of the South Fork operation, well sited and well built, and 2 years ahead of the disaster that had made it valuable, and thought about the specific quality of mind that built an outcome before it manufactured the circumstances that made the outcome necessary. "How many men does he run?" Eldridge said. "6 hands regular," she said. "2 more when the cattle work requires it. Plus Wiley Foss, who does the fence work and the north pasture riding." She paused. "And whoever he uses for the other work, which isn't the regular hands. The regular hands are ranchers. They work cattle." "You think he contracts the other work," Eldridge said. "I think a man that careful about everything else is careful about that too," she said. "He wouldn't use men who knew the operation for work that could be used against the operation." Eldridge continued to look at the South Fork Ranch, at the pump house on the bank, at the pipe runs going north toward the main house and south toward the back corrals. He thought about a man who'd built all of this 2 years ago and had been sitting inside it ever since, patient, acquiring what he needed through process and time, and the occasional catastrophic accident, waiting for the federal land office to eventually produce what it eventually produced, which was a bounty man from Dodge City who had ridden into a barn in no man's land yesterday afternoon and drunk flat coffee with the one person in the strip who'd been building a counter case for 2 years. He thought about Dessa Galt's wire to the land office 6 months ago, and the form letter she'd gotten back, and the 6 months between the wire and his arrival, and what Calhoun had done with those 6 months. "He knows what's in your ledger," Eldridge said. Dessa looked at him. "If he's known since your first wire that someone was building a case against him," Eldridge said, "then he knows everything in that ledger is the shape of what he's up against. The timeline, the water rights filing dates, the transfer sequence." He looked at the South Fork Ranch. "He's had 6 months to decide which parts of that case have answers he can produce and which parts don't." "And the parts that don't," Dessa said. "Are the parts worth finding?" Eldridge said. She looked at the South Fork Ranch across the Cimarron for a long moment. And what was in her face wasn't fear, and wasn't the performance of resolve either. It was something more considered and more settled than either of those. The expression of a woman who'd been living inside this situation for 2 years and had already done her accounting of what it was likely to cost and had decided to go forward anyway, and had been going forward anyway every day, sleeping in her barn and keeping her lamp burning and maintaining the house's appearance from the road as if she were living in it. "The parts worth finding," she said, "are in that ranch house." "Yes," Eldridge said. "They probably are." He looked at the pump house one more time and turned the roan back west, toward the Galt place, toward the barn and the workbench and the ledger and the flat coffee and the specific patient work of understanding a situation completely before making a move inside it. Dessa rode beside him and said nothing further, which was the right call, because everything that needed to be said about the shape of the problem had been said on the north bank of the Cimarron in the drought-clear morning air. And what came next was a different kind of work that didn't benefit from more talking. The roan moved under him in the heat, already building toward the day's full weight, and the Cimarron ran its thin thread in the gravel bed below them, and across it Reuben Calhoun's pump house sat on its south bank foundation, doing exactly what it had been built to do, which was hold what it held and make everything downstream a matter of his decision. Chapter 3. He sent no word ahead. Not because Calhoun didn't. He already knew he was coming. Dessa had made clear that Calhoun had known he was coming since before the warrant cleared the land office in Dodge. And sending advance notice of the visit would have added nothing to that knowledge except a date. But because arriving without announcement was the one variable Eldridge still controlled in a situation where most of the variables had been controlled by someone else for 2 years, and a man who showed up to a prepared position at least owed it to himself to choose his own hour. He rode south on a Thursday morning, alone, and crossed the Cimarron at the ford in the early heat and followed the South Fork Road toward the ranch. And he read the country as he wrote it, the way he'd been reading everything since Dessa Galt handed him her ledger in the barn 2 days ago, not looking for one thing but receiving everything and sorting it as it arrived. The South Fork Road was well maintained. Not a county road, a private road, graded and drained at the low crossings, with culverts in the draws that showed recent work, the kind of road a man built when he expected to move things along it regularly and didn't want the weather to make decisions for him about when he could. The fences running along both sides of it were 4-strand wire on steel posts, the posts driven plumb and at uniform intervals, the wire tensioned to the specific tightness that said a professional crew had done it rather than ranch hands working between other jobs. Everything about the approach to Reuben Calhane's operation said a man who built things to last and built them right and had the resources to do both. He came through the gate, open, flanked by 2 upright posts with a crossbar carrying a brand iron, the brand a simple CR in the specific blocked style of a man who wanted his mark readable at distance, and into the yard. And the yard was what the ranch from across the river had promised it would be. Substantial, organized, every building in its logical place relative to every other building, the whole arrangement having the quality of something designed rather than accreted, built to a plan rather than expanded by necessity over time. 2 hands were working at the near corral, one shoeing a horse and one holding it. And they both looked at Eldridge when he came through the gate with the neutral, assessing attention of men whose employer had told them a visitor was coming, and to behave accordingly. Neither of them came toward him, and neither of them moved away. He rode to the main house and stopped. Reuben Calhane came out onto the porch before Eldridge had finished dismounting, which meant he'd been watching from inside. Not the porch, which would have announced the watching, but a window from which he could see the gate and the approach road, and a visitor's face and manner long before the visitor reached the house. He came out with a cup of coffee in one hand, and the unhurried ease of a man stepping outside for the morning air. And he stood at the porch's edge and looked at Eldridge the way a man looked at weather he'd been expecting. He was perhaps 50, as the land office files had suggested, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of build that had been physical labor once and had since become simply structure, the permanent record of a working life in a body that no longer needed to do the working. His face was weathered to the specific dark, even color that 20 years of outdoor work produced, with the deep eye-corner lines of a man who'd spent those years squinting into distances, and his eyes, when Eldridge reached the porch steps and could see them clearly, were a pale, steady brown that held their focus without effort. He looked like a rancher. He looked like 20 ranchers Eldridge had met across 3 states. He looked like the kind of man that county sheriffs and circuit court judges and land office administrators treated with the instinctive respect of people recognizing someone who had built something real in difficult country, which was a quality that Eldridge suspected Calhane had cultivated with the same deliberate attention he'd brought to the fences and the road and the pump house on the south bank. "Sample," Calhane said. His voice was even, unhurried, pitched for normal conversation rather than the distance between the porch edge and the bottom of the steps. "Calhane," Eldridge said. "Come up," Calhane said. "Coffee's fresh." The inside of the main house confirmed what the outside had suggested, a working rancher's house, furnished for use rather than display, with good furniture that had been chosen for durability and was showing the honest wear of daily use. A stone fireplace along the north wall, with a mantel holding a clock and 2 photographs. A kitchen visible through a doorway, a Mexican woman working at the stove. A door off the main room that stood slightly ajar and showed through the gap the edge of a desk and the corner of a bookcase, the ranch office, Eldridge noted, which was where Dessa had said the document case would be, and which he noted the position of in relation to the room he was standing in and the windows and the exterior doors, and filed it all without looking at it longer than a single casual sweep warranted. Calhoun poured him coffee. Good coffee. The quality of water on the South Fork apparently different from the North, or Calhoun's cook simply better at the craft, and gestured at the chairs by the fireplace, and they sat. And for a moment neither of them said anything, and the moment had the quality of two men each waiting to see whether the other would fill the silence first. Eldridge let it go longer than was comfortable, and didn't fill it. Calhoun looked at him across the moment with the pale brown eyes, and something in them shifted, not discomfort, not the performance of patience over discomfort, but the specific recalibration of a man who'd been told one thing about the visitor, and was now, in the first 60 seconds of the visit, updating the account. "You've been on the North Fork 2 days, Calhoun said. "I have," Eldridge said. "You talked to Dessa Galt." "I'm staying at the Galt place," Eldridge said. Calhoun looked at his coffee. "She's a capable woman," he said. Orrin Galt had sense enough to know it. "I'll give him that, whatever else." He said this without edge, in the flat, acknowledging way of a man giving credit where credit was due, because disputing it would cost him more than granting it. "She's been thorough in her complaints." "Her documentation is organized," Eldridge said. "I'm sure it is." Calhoun drank his coffee. "I want to say something plainly, Mr. Sample, because I think plain talk serves us both better than the alternative here. The warrant you're carrying covers fraudulent land filings. I understand that charge, and I've had counsel prepare a response to it, and that response is thorough and well-grounded, and I'm confident in it." He looked at Eldridge steadily. "What the warrant doesn't cover, because the warrant is a land office instrument and not a sheriff's instrument, is anything regarding the deaths of my neighbors. Those deaths were investigated by the county and ruled accidental, and the ruling stands. I'm not going to address them here because there's nothing to address." He paused. "I want you to know that I know the difference between what the warrant covers and what you're actually here for, because I think pretending otherwise wastes both our mornings." It was, Eldridge thought, an exceptionally well-constructed opening. It was honest about the shape of the situation in a way that sounded like transparency and functioned as a wall. Here is what we're discussing, and here is what we're not discussing, defined and bounded before the conversation had properly begun, by the man with the most to lose from the conversation going somewhere unbounded. "I appreciate the plain talk," Eldridge said. "I'll return it. I've read Dessa Galt's documentation, and the county inquest records, and the land office files on the water rights transfers, and I have questions about the sequence of the transfers that the filed copies don't fully answer. I'll need to see the originals." Calhoun looked at him. "The originals," he said. "Filed copies go to the recorder's office," Eldridge said. "Originals return to the filer. The warrant authorizes examination of original documentation relevant to the filing dates in question." He paused. "I'd like to see your copies of the original filings." The pale brown eyes held on him for a moment without moving, not the involuntary flutter of a man surprised or alarmed, but the deliberate steadiness of a man taking the measure of a statement before he responded to it. "Priscilla," Calhoun said. A door at the back of the main room opened, and Priscilla Dace came through it, and Eldridge understood without any particular surprise that she had been in the house since before he arrived, probably since he'd crossed the Cimarron at the ford, having been summoned from Liberal sometime in the last 2 days, and having come immediately, which said something about both the relationship and the fee. She was perhaps 40, compact, dressed with the practical precision of a woman who had long since decided that being taken seriously in her line of work required looking like someone who took the work seriously, and who had no patience for the performance of femininity that the alternative would have required. She carried a document case, leather, good quality, brass clasp, and she set it on the table between the chairs without opening it, and looked at Eldridge with the focused, professional attention of someone assessing an opponent's position before responding to it. "Mr. Sample," she said. "Priscilla Dace. I represent Mr. Calhoun in the matter of the federal land warrant." "I know who you are," Eldridge said. "Then you know I've reviewed the warrant thoroughly," she said, "and I have significant procedural objections to its scope that I intend to raise before the district court in Wichita." She opened the document case and produced a paper. Specifically, the warrant's authorization for examination of original documents is conditioned on those documents being identified with particularity in the warrant application, which they are not. The application refers generically to water rights filings without specifying dates, parcel descriptions, or filing numbers. She held the paper out. "This is a formal objection to document examination pending the court's ruling. Mr. Calhoun will not be producing original documents until that ruling is in hand." Eldridge looked at the paper, but didn't take it. He looked at Priscilla Dace, who had come through the back door of a ranch house in no man's land with a formal objection already written and ready, which meant she'd prepared it before his arrival, which meant she'd known he would ask for the originals, which meant either Calhoun had told her he would ask or she was good enough at her work to have anticipated it. And from everything the land office files had suggested about her record, both were probably true. He looked at Calhoun. Calhoun sat with his coffee and his patient, unhurried composure and looked back at him. "I'll want to walk the property," Eldridge said. "The South Fork water operation. The pump house." "Of course," Calhoun said without a pause. "Any part of the ranch you want to see. Freely and without limitation." He said this in the specific tone of a man extending an invitation he knew would find nothing, which was either the confidence of innocence or the confidence of thorough preparation. And the distance between those two things was not something Eldridge could measure from a chair by a fireplace on a Thursday morning. "I'll take you myself," Calhoun said. He stood and set his coffee on the mantel. He was a thorough and knowledgeable guide. He walked Eldridge through the operation in the specific sequence of a man proud of what he'd built and willing to demonstrate the pride, which was either genuine or the most complete performance of genuine that Eldridge had encountered in 4 books of pursuing people who performed things. The pump house first, a solid stone structure on the south bank, housing a steam-powered pump of recent manufacture, with a pipe system running north to the main house and east to the back corrals and west to a stock tank that served the south pastures. "Built it in '81, Calhoun said, standing in the pump house doorway. "Before the drought. People thought I was spending money foolishly on infrastructure the river already provided for free." He looked at the pump. "The river doesn't provide for free in a drought year." "No," Eldridge said. "It doesn't." "I planned for it," Calhoun said. "That's not a crime. Planning is what separates an operation that survives a bad year from one that doesn't." Eldridge looked at the pump and looked at the pipe runs and looked at the south bank of the Cimarron where the foundation sat and thought about when, specifically, in '81 the pump house construction had begun, before June when Orrin Galt drowned or after, and whether the land office files had a date he could confirm that against. He wrote nothing in front of Calhoun. He'd write it later. The corrals, the bunkhouse, the second barn, all of it shone without hesitation. Every door opened, every question answered in the even, informative manner of a man conducting a tour of a legitimate enterprise and finding the exercise unremarkable. The hands they passed worked without looking up. The specific behavior of men who'd been told to behave normally and were behaving normally, which looked like normalcy and felt like performance and was probably both. At the back pasture fence, Calhoun stopped and turned, facing north, across the Cimarron toward the Galt Place's rise visible in the distance. "You're going to ask me about Orrin Galt," Calhoun said. Eldridge said nothing. "I knew Orrin Galt 11 years, Calhoun said. "We were never friends, different dispositions, different ways of working, but we were neighbors, and in this country neighbors have obligations to each other that don't depend on friendship." He looked at the north bank. "His death was a loss. I don't say that because it serves me to say it. I say it because it's true, and because I'd rather you hear it directly than form an opinion about whether I'm capable of saying it." "Tell me about the water rights filing," Eldridge said. "The one with his signature on it. 2 weeks before he died." Calhoun turned from the north bank and looked at Eldridge with the pale brown eyes. "Orrin came to me," Calhoun said, "in May of '81. He was carrying debt from the previous winter, feed costs, a hay loan that had come due before he expected, the specific kind of short-term trouble that small operations in this country run into, and that the banks and liberal are not particularly sympathetic about. He proposed a transaction. He would transfer the North Fork water rights in exchange for a cash payment and a 5-year grazing lease on the south pastures." He held Eldridge's gaze. "I was reluctant. Water rights in perpetuity for a short-term cash infusion struck me as a poor trade for him. I told him so. He disagreed. We executed the filing and liberal with a notary present, and he took the money and paid his hay note." He paused. 6 weeks later, he drowned. And Dessa Galt, who I believe loved her husband and believes everything she's told you about him, cannot accept that he made a decision she considers uncharacteristic, because accepting it would mean accepting a version of him she doesn't want to hold. It was, Eldridge thought, a good account. Internally consistent, emotionally credible, specific enough to be convincing, and general enough to be unverifiable in its details, built on the one true thing that complicated the whole case, that Dessa Galt's certainty about her husband was the kind of certainty that came from love, and love was not always the most accurate form of knowledge about a person. He looked at Reuben Calhoun, standing at his back pasture fence in the August heat with the Cimarron barely moving in the gravel bed below them, and the north bank's dried grass running all the way to the rise where the Galt Place sat solid and quiet in the distance. Calhoun looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment had the same quality as the one at the beginning. Two men each aware of exactly what the other knew and didn't know, the distance between the knowing and the proof, the only thing the moment was actually about. "I'll ride out," Eldridge said. "You're welcome back," Calhoun said. "Any time. The gate's open." He said this in the specific tone of a man who knew the gates being open was the most effective, closed door available to him. An invitation so confident and so complete that the man receiving it understood he would find nothing here that Calhoun hadn't already decided he could find, and walked back toward the main house at his even, unhurried pace. And Eldridge watched him go, and then turned the roan north toward the ford. Priscilla Dace caught him at the gate. She came from the direction of the house on a good gray horse at a pace that said she'd left the house shortly after he had, and had ridden the long way around the corrals rather than directly, which meant she hadn't wanted Calhoun to see her go. She pulled up alongside him at the gate, and looked at the road north and then looked at him. "The objection I filed this morning," she said. "It will hold up procedurally. I want you to understand that. I'm not throwing paper at you to slow you down. I'm raising a genuine legal issue that a Wichita judge will take seriously." "I understood that when you handed it to me," Eldridge said. "What I also want you to understand," she said, and her voice had changed register from the professional precision of the house, "is that my objection covers the document examination. It doesn't cover other evidence." She looked at the North Bank Road, the road toward Bluff Creek, toward Desagalt's Rise, toward the Pounder boundary post with the P scratched into its cap. "The warrants fraud case is my problem to manage, and I'll manage it. Whatever else is here is not a document matter, and I'd be doing myself a professional disservice to pretend it is." She looked at him directly. "The pumphouse construction began in March of '81, she said. "Not after the rights transfers. Before them." She turned the gray horse back toward the ranch. "I looked it up when I took the case. I like to understand the timeline I'm defending before I start defending it." She rode back through the gate without looking at him again, and Eldridge watched her go with the specific attention of a man receiving a piece of information from a direction he hadn't fully anticipated, and turning it over to see what it connected to. March of '81. The pumphouse construction had begun in March. Orrin Galt had drowned in June. The water rights filing bearing Orrin's signature was dated 2 weeks before the drowning, May. A man who began building water infrastructure in March had decided in March that he was going to control the North Fork water rights. The acquisition of those rights through signed transfers and the deaths that followed the transfers came after the infrastructure decision, not before it. The plan had preceded the means by at least 2 months. Eldridge rode north across the Cimarron, with the pumphouse visible behind him in the South Bank Foundation and Priscilla Dace's retreating figure visible beyond it, and Reuben Calhoun visible not at all, which was how Calhoun preferred it, always behind something, always at one remove from whatever was about to happen, patient and unhurried, and thoroughly prepared, and waiting, as he had been waiting for 2 years, for the situation to resolve itself in his favor through the simple mechanism of outlasting everyone who stood between him and what he intended to have. The Rhone crossed the ford. The Cimarron ran its thin thread under them. Eldridge rode north toward Desagalt's Rise and thought about a man who'd started building a pumphouse in March, and a woman who'd been sleeping in her barn since February, and the 8 months between a land office wire and a federal warrant, and what a patient man could do with 8 months when patience was the only weapon he'd decided he needed. Chapter 4. He found him at the river. Not by design. He'd ridden east along the north bank the following evening with the intention of re-examining the Pounder boundary and the ground around the prickly pear stand in the low, raking light that the late afternoon put on things the midday obscured. And Wiley Foss was simply there when he arrived, sitting on the bank's edge above the gravel bar with his boots off and his feet in the thin current, looking at the water the way Dessa had described, the way that said he needed the river more than he needed anything else that evening. Eldridge pulled up 20 yards back and got down quietly and tied the roan to a cottonwood and sat on the bank himself, upstream, where Wiley could see him without having to turn his head entirely. He didn't speak. Wiley looked at him for a moment with the flat, assessing attention of a young man who'd been assessed by enough strangers in the last 2 years to have developed a working system for processing them, and then looked back at the river, which Eldridge took as neither welcome nor rejection, but simply the honest communication of someone who hadn't decided yet. The river ran. A killdeer worked the gravel bar below them with its quick, mechanical precision, finding whatever the drought had left for it to find. The heat was dropping out of the day by degrees, the evening air coming off the grass with the faint mineral smell of dry ground that had been hot all day and was now releasing what the heat had drawn out of it. Eldridge took out his small book and read back through what he'd written. The accumulated notes from 4 days of riding the drainage and one morning at the South Fork Ranch, and let the reading occupy him in a visible and genuine way that communicated clearly that he was not primarily here for Wiley Foss this evening, whatever else might develop. After 20 minutes, Wiley said, "You were at the South Fork yesterday." "I was," Eldridge said. "Calhoun say anything useful?" "Calhoun said a great many things," Eldridge said. "How useful they are depends on whether they're true." Wiley looked at the river. He was perhaps 24, lean with the working leanness of a young man who hadn't yet put on the weight that steady ranch work eventually built, with a face that had started open and was in the process of closing in the specific way that difficult circumstances closed young faces, not hardening exactly, more a contraction, the features pulling slightly inward as if making themselves smaller targets. "He give you the tour," Wiley said. "He did." "Show you the pump house?" "That too." Wiley pulled one foot out of the current and looked at it and put it back. "He shows everybody the pump house," he said. "Like it's a point of pride. Like the fact that he built it before the drought proves something about his character." He paused. "I've thought about that pump house a lot. The fact that he started it in March of '81. Eldridge looked at him. "How do you know when it started?" Eldridge said. "Because my father hired on 2 of the construction crew when Calhoun let them go in April," Wiley said. "They'd been framing the foundation for 6 weeks at that point, and Calhoun let them go because the foundation work was done, and he was bringing in a different crew for the pipe runs who already knew the equipment." He looked at the river. "My father mentioned it at the time because he was glad of the hands. He wrote it in his work ledger. April 14th, '81, 2 men from the South Fork construction job. My father kept good records." He paused. "I have the ledger." Eldridge held this carefully. "Where is it?" he said. "My room," Wiley said. "At the bunkhouse." He said it with the specific, strangled quality of a man who understood exactly where the thing of value was and exactly what its location cost him to acknowledge. Eldridge looked at the river and said nothing, because the ledger's existence and location and what it proved were things Wiley had been carrying alone long enough that rushing toward them now would only push him back. "He know you have it," Eldridge said. "I don't think so," Wiley said. "My father kept it in a tin box in the barn, not the house. When the property went into probate, I took the tin box before anyone could go through the barn for personal effects. I don't know if anyone noticed." He turned his foot in the current, watching the water move around it. "The ledger doesn't prove anything by itself. It proves my father hired 2 men in April, and that those men had been working the South Fork foundation since March. It doesn't prove why the pump house was built when it was built. It proves the timeline," Eldridge said, "which is its own kind of proof." "Proof of what?" Wiley said. Not combative, genuinely asking, the question of a young man who'd been sitting on a fact for 2 years without knowing what to do with it, and was now, for the first time, in a conversation where someone might be able to answer. "That the plan preceded the rights acquisitions by at least 2 months, Eldridge said. "That Calhoun decided he needed the North Fork water rights in March, before any of the signed transfers existed, before your father or Orrin Galt or August Pounder had agreed to anything." He paused. "A man who genuinely bought water rights from willing sellers because an opportunity presented itself doesn't build the infrastructure 2 months before the opportunity presents itself. He builds it after. The sequence matters." Wiley looked at the water running over his feet. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. "That's what I've thought for 2 years, and I didn't know how to say it, so it sounded like what it was rather than like a son who couldn't accept that his father's ranch was gone. "It sounds like both," Eldridge said. "That doesn't make it wrong." Wiley looked at him with the sharp, reflexive attention of someone receiving unexpected honesty. "The ledger's not the only thing," he said after a moment. Eldridge waited. Wiley pulled his feet out of the water and set them on the bank and looked at them drying in the evening air. He was working through something. Eldridge could see it in the set of his shoulders, the specific tension of a person managing the gap between what they decided to say and the saying of it, which was its own kind of labor and deserved its own kind of patience. "November," Wiley said. "When my father died. I was in the Panhandle. I came home when word reached me, which took 4 days. And by the time I arrived, the inquest was already finished, and the ruling was accidental, and there wasn't anything to argue with because the county coroner had signed it, and it was done." He looked east along the bank. "What I know, what I've never told anyone because I didn't know who to tell, and I knew it would look like grief talking rather than fact, is that my father rode the section road between his place and Calhoun's 5 days a week every week for 5 years. He rode it in the dark. He rode it in bad weather. He knew every foot of it." He stopped. "Go on," Eldridge said. "His horse came back without him," Wiley said. "Everyone said the horse threw him. I know that horse. I broke that horse. He was a 14-year-old bay named Cutter, who hadn't done anything unexpected in 10 years, and who my father had ridden so long they'd worked out every disagreement there was to work out between a man and a horse." He paused. "Cutter came back to the barn with his reins broken. Not the bit ring, not the buckle, the leather itself snapped, both reins close to the bit." He looked at Eldridge. "A horse that throws a rider doesn't break both reins. The reins go slack when the rider falls. They might get stepped on, might get tangled, but they don't snap at the bit end from the same direction on both sides unless something pulled them." Eldridge looked at him. "Something pulled Cutter to a stop," Wiley said. "Hard enough to snap both reins. And then Cutter came home without my father, who was found a mile south with a head injury the coroner called a fall. The killdeer on the gravel bar had stopped working and was standing still, 1 foot raised, listening to something in the grass below the bank that Eldridge couldn't hear. "You kept the bridle," Eldridge said. Wiley looked at him. "The tin box in the barn," Eldridge said. "When you took the ledger." Something moved across Wiley Foss's face, the specific expression of a person being accurately read by someone who shouldn't have been able to read them that quickly, the combination of relief and exposure that came with being understood faster than you'd prepared for. "It's in the box," he said. "Both pieces. I cut the remaining leather off the bit rings and kept them." He looked at his hands in his lap. "I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it. I just knew I couldn't leave it." "You did the right thing," Eldridge said. "Keeping it." "Does it prove anything?" Wiley said. "The way you asked about the ledger. Does it prove anything by itself?" "No," Eldridge said. "By itself, it proves a bridle broke. Combined with your father's riding history on that road, combined with the pump house timeline, combined with the sequence of rights transfers," he paused. "It builds a picture. Juries read pictures." Wiley looked at the river. "A jury," he said. It came out flat, without hope, but without despair either. The tone of someone who had thought about juries and courts and legal processes and had not arrived at confident conclusions. "Wichita," Eldridge said. "Federal court. Not liberal, not a county inquest. A federal judge with no relationship to this strip of country, and no obligation to the conclusions that were convenient 2 years ago." Wiley looked at him steadily. "You're asking me to testify?" "Not tonight," Eldridge said. Tonight, I'm sitting on a riverbank talking to a man who needed the river more than he needed conversation. The testifying question comes later, when there's something for you to testify in support of. He paused. What I'm asking tonight is whether you'll let me look at the tin box. Wiley looked at the river for a long moment. The thin current, the white gravel, the killdeer now moving again below them in its quick, mechanical way, finding what it needed in a river that didn't have much left to offer. Not tonight, he said. Not at the bunkhouse. If anyone sees you there. I know it, Eldridge said. There's a draw on the north bank, Wiley said. 2 miles west of the Pounder boundary. It runs south from a cedar break down to the river. There's a cedar at the draw's mouth with a lightning scar on the south side. He paused. I can be there Sunday morning before first light. I have Sunday mornings. Sunday, Eldridge said. Wiley nodded and pulled his boots on with the practiced sequence of a man who'd been putting boots on riverbanks for 24 years, and stood and looked at Eldridge from his full height, which was an inch above Eldridge's own. One more thing, Wiley said. Go ahead. Brother Asa. Eldridge said nothing, and let the name sit there. Wiley looked momentarily confused. I'm sorry, he said. I don't know why I said that. He stopped. He shook his head. I meant one more thing about Calhoun. Eldridge looked at him. Calhoun has a man, Wiley said. Not one of the regular hands. A man who comes and goes, stays at the bunkhouse when he's on the property, doesn't mix with the other hands and nobody asks him to. I've seen him 3 times in 8 months. Calhoun calls him by a first name I haven't heard clearly enough to be sure of. He paused. The regular hands don't talk about him. When I asked about him early on, I got nothing from anyone, which in a bunkhouse is a specific kind of answer. What does he look like? Eldridge said. Thin, Wiley said. 40 maybe. Quiet, the way some men are quiet, because there's something underneath the quiet they don't want moving around. He picked up a stone from the bank and looked at it and set it down. The last time he was on the property was 3 weeks ago. 2 days before you rode down from Dodge. Eldridge held this. Calhoun had sent for Priscilla Dace when the land office wire arrived. He'd had the formal objection ready before Eldridge crossed the Cimarron. He'd walked Eldridge through the entire operation with the confident openness of a man showing a room he'd already cleaned. And 3 weeks ago, 2 days before Eldridge arrived, the man who came and went and didn't mix with the regular hands had been on the South Fork property. Does he have a horse he keeps there? Eldridge said. No, Wiley said. He comes with his own and leaves with it. Which direction? Wiley looked west along the south bank, toward the ford, toward the section road that connected the strip to the main road north toward Dodge. West, he said. Always west. He walked back up the bank, toward the South Fork Road, his boots leaving the specific narrow print of a young man who walked with his weight slightly forward, and Eldridge watched him go, and then sat alone on the north bank with his small book open in his lap, and the evening light going gold over the dried grass, and the killdeer still working its gravel bar below him. He wrote down what Wiley had said about the bridle. He wrote down what Wiley had said about the man who came and went. He wrote down west and drew a line under it, and then wrote the pump house construction date, March, and drew a line under that too, and looked at the 2 underlined facts in the low light and thought about what a patient man did when patience was about to run out. He thought about Priscilla Dace turning her gray horse back through the gate, and the specific quality of what she'd said. The pump house construction began in March, and what it had cost a careful lawyer to say it, and what saying it meant about what she knew versus what she'd agreed to defend. He closed the book. The killdeer called once from the gravel bar, its flat, urgent, carrying call, the sound of a small bird insisting on its own presence in an enormous piece of country, and then flew low over the water east toward the pounder boundary and was gone. Eldridge sat a moment longer in the cooling air. Then he went to the roan and untied her and mounted and rode west along the north bank toward Dessa Galt's rise. And the river ran below him in its thin thread, and somewhere on the south bank's section rode, riding west as he always rode west. The man who came and went was putting distance between himself and the South Fork in the specific direction of a man returning to wherever he waited when he wasn't needed. Eldridge rode and thought about what a patient man needed when patience wasn't going to be sufficient anymore. He thought about what that need looked like when it rode west. Chapter 5. Liberal sat 40 miles northwest of the Cimarron, on the flat, open table country that the drought had reduced to something that looked, from the south road coming in, like a pencil sketch of a town. The outlines present, the shading gone, everything bleached to the color of the paper underneath it. It was a county seat that had grown up around the courthouse rather than around commerce, which gave it a specific quality of official gravity that the surrounding country's plainness amplified rather than relieved. The streets were wide and mostly empty in the August heat. The courthouse occupied the center of the main block with the particular self-importance of county courthouses everywhere. 2 stories of limestone that had been quarried 20 miles east and hauled in at considerable expense to communicate that the law intended to be here permanently, regardless of what the weather thought about it. Eldridge rode in on a Friday morning and went to the county recorder's office first. Not because the recorder's office held anything he hadn't already seen in Dessa's ledger, but because the recorder's office was where Priscilla Dace would expect him to go. And showing up where you were expected was sometimes the most useful thing you could do, because it confirmed a story someone was already telling themselves about you, and left you free to work the edges of that story without interrupting it. He spent an hour with the filed copies of the water rights transfers, taking notes in his small book with the methodical attention of a man doing due diligence on a legal matter, which was what he was doing, and which also gave the recorder's clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, and the watchful, cataloging attention of someone who understood that his job made him the first point of contact for everyone who came to examine county records. Time to note his presence, and presumably communicate it to whoever in Liberal had an interest in knowing when Eldridge Sample came to town. He was at lunch at the hotel dining room when Priscilla Dace came through the door. She came alone, without the document case, and she came at the pace of a woman who decided to be somewhere and was being there, and she sat down across from him without being invited with the same direct, unself-conscious efficiency she'd brought to the chair beside Calhoun's fireplace. "You went to the recorder's office first," she said. "I did," Eldridge said. "Find anything the filed copies hadn't already told you?" "No," he said. She looked at the menu card on the table without picking it up. "I'll tell you something about the filed copies that might save you time," she said. "They're clean. Not just facially clean. I've had a document examiner look at them. The paper, the ink, the impression of the pen, everything consistent with the date on the filing, everything consistent with a notarized transaction conducted in this office in the normal course of business." She looked at him. "If you're building a forgery case on the filed copies, you don't have one." "The originals," Eldridge said, "are subject to my objection, which stands until the Wichita court rules otherwise." She said this without apology and without the performance of regret. "I filed the objection because it's a valid objection, Mr. Sample, not to obstruct your investigation. I want that distinction clear." "It's clear," Eldridge said. The waiter came, and she ordered coffee and a sandwich with the clipped efficiency of a woman who ate at working lunches frequently and had reduced the process of ordering to its minimum. Eldridge ordered more coffee and waited. "You've been riding the North Fork," she said when the waiter left. "4 days," Eldridge said. "You talked to Wiley Foss." He looked at her. "Wiley sits on the North Bank some evenings," she said. One of Calhoun's hands mentioned it. "It's not a secret." She looked at the table. "Wiley Foss is a young man in a genuinely terrible position, Mr. Sample. I want you to understand that I understand that, regardless of who I represent in this matter." "What's his position from where you sit?" Eldridge said. "His position," she said carefully, "is that he works for the man he believes, and I use that word without committing to whether the belief is accurate, killed his father. He works for that man because the alternative is no work and no income in a strip of country where both of those things are necessary for survival, and because staying close to Calhoun is the only proximity to the truth of what happened to Len Foss that Wiley has access to." She looked at Eldridge. "I've thought about Wiley Foss more than my professional obligations strictly require." "You know what he has," Eldridge said. She looked at him with the focused professional attention that characterized everything she did, and in it was the specific quality of a lawyer deciding, in real time, exactly how much of what she knew was compatible with what she was willing to say. "I know what a careful young man who loved his father might have preserved from a barn before a probate inventory got to it," she said. "I know what a man who kept good records would have had in a work ledger that might have survived with that young man." She drank her coffee when it arrived. "I don't know specifically. I've chosen not to know specifically for reasons that should be apparent." "Because specifically would put you in a conflict," Eldridge said. "Because specifically would require me to make a choice between my client and my obligations as an officer of the court," she said. "And I'd prefer to make that choice at the moment it becomes unavoidable rather than in advance of it." She looked at him steadily. "It hasn't become unavoidable yet." Eldridge drank his coffee and looked at her, at the compact, precise, professionally armored face, and underneath the armor the specific discomfort of a competent person who had taken a case and then found, somewhere in the working of it, that the case had edges she hadn't fully examined before she committed to its defense. "The pump house," he said. She looked at the table. "You told me March," he said. "At the gate. You didn't have to do that." "I told you a fact that's in the public record," she said. "The construction permits are filed at this courthouse. Anyone who looked would find them." She paused. "I told you because you were going to spend time finding it yourself, and I didn't see the value in watching you spend time I could save you." "That's one reason," Eldridge said. She looked at him. "The other reason," he said, "is that you took a case and then found something in the timeline that your client didn't mention to you when he retained you, and the not mentioning of it changed the character of what you'd agreed to defend. And you're a careful enough lawyer, an honest enough person that you couldn't entirely let that go." Priscilla Dace looked at him for a long moment. Her sandwich arrived, and she looked at it and didn't pick it up. "I defend the fraud charge," she said quietly. "That's what I was retained for, and that's what I'll do, and I'll do it well, because the procedural objection is valid and the filed copies are clean, and a federal judge is going to have a genuinely difficult time getting past either of those facts." She looked up. "What I was not retained to defend, and what I would not defend if asked, is anything beyond the fraud charge. I want that stated clearly between us." "It's stated," Eldridge said. "The man who comes and goes," she said. She said it to the table, not to him. in the specific register of someone saying something they'd decided to say before they'd worked out entirely why they were saying it. Eldridge waited. "I don't know his name," she said. "Calhoun has never mentioned him to me, and I've never asked, because asking would move me from not knowing to knowing, and not knowing is the position I've chosen to maintain." She picked up her sandwich and set it down again. "But I've seen him. Once, leaving the South Fork as I was arriving. Thin man, 40 or so, quiet horse, no particular identifying feature, except that he looked at me on the road the way men look at you when they're assessing whether you're a problem." She paused. "He rides west." "I know it," Eldridge said. She looked at him sharply. "Wiley," he said. She nodded once, slowly, the nod of a woman confirming a piece of a picture she'd been assembling in private and was now learning someone else had been assembling in parallel. "West of here," Eldridge said, "on the main road toward Hugoton, there are 3 towns inside of 30 miles. I'm going to ride them when I leave Liberal today." "I can't help you with that," she said. "I'm not asking you to," he said. She looked at her uneaten sandwich, and then at the window facing Liberal's Main Street, at the bleached, drought-plain afternoon outside it, at the limestone courthouse across the street, holding its official gravity against the weather's indifference. "The Wichita ruling on my objection will come in 3 weeks," she said. "Possibly 4. If it goes against me, and it might, I want to be honest about that, the original documents become available for examination, and whatever a document examiner finds in them is what it is." She looked at him. "I'm telling you the timeline, so you understand how much time you have to build the rest of what you're building before the document question forces a conclusion." 3 weeks, Eldridge said. "Or 4, she said. "Use them." She picked up her sandwich finally and ate it with the same clipped efficiency she brought to everything, and they didn't speak further, and Eldridge finished his coffee and paid for both their meals over her objection, and went out into the bleached Liberal afternoon. He rode west out of Liberal on the Hugoton Road in the early afternoon with the sun directly overhead and the shadow of the roan compressed beneath her to almost nothing, the flat country on both sides of the road offering no shade and no relief and no particular interest beyond its own enormous drought-stricken self. The first town was Kismet, 8 miles out, a scattering of buildings around a grain elevator that the drought had made temporarily irrelevant, with a saloon and a dry goods store and a livery and a population that looked to be somewhere between 100 and optimism. He spent an hour there, asking after a thin, quiet man on a quiet horse who rode west with no apparent fixed destination, and got nothing useful from the saloon, and one thing from the liveryman, a heavy-set Swede named Anderson, who kept his stalls clean, and his records in a ledger that he maintained with the specific, prideful accuracy of a man for whom the ledger was an argument about who he was. "Thin man, you say?" Anderson said, looking at his ledger. "Quiet horse." "That's right," Eldridge said. "He comes through," Anderson said. "Not regular. 4 times this year, maybe 5. He boards his horse here overnight and rides out in the morning." He turned the ledger around and showed Eldridge the entries, a name each time the same, R. Kask. A horse description, Gray Gelding, no brand. A direction noted in the departure column, which Anderson kept as a matter of habit, W. "He say anything?" Eldridge said. "Where he was going?" "He don't say much of anything," Anderson said. "Pays in advance. Doesn't drink. Eats at the hotel and goes to bed." He looked at the ledger. "Last time was 3 weeks back. Stayed 1 night. 3 weeks back. 2 days before Eldridge rode south from Dodge." "The hotel," Eldridge said. "He register under the same name." "That I can't tell you," Anderson said. "But Mabel Prout runs it, and she keeps her own ledger, and she's particular about names. Mabel Prout was particular about names, and her ledger confirmed R. Case on the same dates as Anderson's, and she added one thing Anderson hadn't, that R. Case, on his most recent stay, had sent a telegram from the Kismet depot before he left in the morning, which she knew because the depot was next door to the hotel, and she'd seen him go in. The depot agent was a young man named Ferris, who had the specific nervous energy of someone who spent his days receiving and sending other people's communications, and had developed strong opinions about the privacy of those communications that were going to require some management. Eldridge showed him Birch Stamey's letter, the one establishing him as an agent of the Pratt County Sheriff, which he'd kept in his coat pocket, across 4 books, now out of the habit of having something official to produce when official was what a situation required. Ferris looked at the letter and looked at Eldridge. "Outgoing," Eldridge said. "3 weeks ago. Man named Case." "I remember him," Ferris said. "Quiet man. Sent one message." "Where to?" Ferris looked at the ceiling, in the way of a man consulting his memory rather than his conscience. "Dodge City," he said. "Land office." Eldridge looked at him. "I remember because it was short," Ferris said. "Short ones stick." It said. He closed his eyes briefly. "Subject arrived. Proceeding as discussed." That was it. Addressed to a name at the land office I didn't recognize. Eldridge wrote this in his small book. Subject arrived. Proceeding as discussed. A telegram sent to the federal land office in Dodge City 2 days before Eldridge rode south, from a man who came and went from Calhoun's South Fork property and rode west to Kismet when he left. He stood outside the Kismet depot in the flat afternoon sun and looked at what he'd written, and thought about the 6 months between Dessa Galt's wire to the land office and the warrant's arrival, and what had been moving in that interval between Dodge and the Strip and back. Someone at the land office had told Calhoun the wire was coming. Dessa had said so, and Eldridge had believed it, and had filed it as a separate problem to be accounted for eventually. He'd been treating the leak at the land office as a passive failure, a clerk who talked, a file that was seen by the wrong person. Subject arrived. Proceeding as discussed. The leak wasn't passive. R. Case sent telegrams to the land office in Dodge reporting Eldridge's movements, which meant someone at the land office was actively managing information flow in both directions. From Dodge to the Strip when a warrant was issued. From the Strip to Dodge when the warrant's agent arrived. The federal investigation into Reuben Calhoun had been compromised from inside the office that had authorized it. Eldridge folded his small book and put it in his coat pocket and looked west down the Hugoton Road, past Kismet's grain elevator and its drought-empty fields, toward the second town 8 miles further on, and thought about 3 weeks and Priscilla Dace's careful, considered decision to tell him how much time he had. She'd known about the timeline. She'd told him anyway. He mounted the roan and rode west. Chapter 6. Wednesday came in hotter than the days before it. The thermometer nailed to the barn's south wall, which Dessa checked each morning as a matter of habit she'd kept since Orrin put the thermometer up 7 years ago, and that she'd kept after he died, because stopping would have felt like a concession to something she wasn't ready to concede. Read 104 at 7 in the morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. By the time she loaded the egg crates into the wagon at 8, it had moved past that and kept going, the mercury climbing with the specific, relentless intention of an August day in no man's land that had decided to make its nature fully known. Eldridge had been awake since 5, when the heat in the tack room had crossed from uncomfortable to genuinely unpleasant, and he'd done what he could with the morning. Fed and watered the horses, checked the windmill's pump mechanism, which had been making a sound it shouldn't make since Tuesday, and that Dessa had noted and not yet had time to address. And now he stood at the barn door and watched her load the crates with the same direct, purposeful efficiency she brought to everything, and said nothing, because everything that needed saying about today had been said the night before. She'd proposed it herself. That was the thing he kept coming back to, standing in the barn door in the early heat. Not that she'd agreed when he raised it, but that she'd raised it first, sitting at the workbench with her ledger, looking at the document case entry and the filing dates, and said plainly that she had the egg delivery on Wednesday and that Calhoun's cook had been taking her eggs every Wednesday for 3 years without interruption, and that the interruption of that arrangement had not yet been worth the attention it would draw, and that Wednesday was therefore an opportunity that existed whether they used it or not. He'd said it was her decision. She'd said she knew it was. He'd said the risk was real, that Calhoun knew she was building a case, had known it for 2 years, and that a visit to the ranch house from Dessa Galt on a Wednesday that happened to coincide with a federal bounty man's presence on the North Fork was a coincidence Calhoun might not accept as coincidence. She'd said that Calhoun had never given her any reason to believe he considered her a serious threat, which was the most useful thing about him, and the thing she'd worked hardest to maintain. Then she'd gone back to her ledger, and he'd gone to the tack room, and that had been the whole of the discussion, which was the way Dessa Galt handled most things, thoroughly and without revisiting them. "I'll be back by noon," she said now, at the wagon. "Don't ride south while I'm gone." He looked at her. "If you ride south while I'm gone, and Calhoun sees you on the road, he'll know the timing isn't coincidence," she said. "Stay on the north bank." "All right," he said. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, straight and without qualification, and then climbed up onto the wagon seat and took the reins and drove south toward the ford. He watched the wagon go down the rise toward the Cimarron until the river timber swallowed it, and then he went back into the barn and sat on the workbench stool in the lamp-free heat and waited. The Calhoun ranch house was cool inside. That was the first thing Dessa registered, stepping through the kitchen door with the egg crates, the adobe walls doing what adobe walls did in the desert heat, holding the night's coolness against the day's assault, providing the specific interior relief that made adobe the only sensible building material in this country, and that Orrin had talked about using when he rebuilt the house, a conversation they'd been having for 3 years when he drowned. Marta, Calhoun's cook, was a compact Mexican woman of 50 who'd been cooking on the South Fork since the ranch's beginning, and who greeted Dessa with the same warm, uncomplicated welcome she'd given her every Wednesday for 3 years, unaffected by whatever the politics of the situation between Dessa and her employer might be, because Marta's relationship to eggs was professional, and her relationship to Calhoun was professional, and her relationship to Dessa was by now something closer to habitual friendship which operated on its own terms. They talked while Marta unpacked the crates, about the heat, about Marta's daughter in Liberal who was expecting her 3rd child, about the state of the kitchen garden that the drought had reduced from productive to aspirational. Dessa talked and listened and poured the coffee that Marta put in front of her, and drank it, and looked at the kitchen the way she always looked at it, as a room she'd been in many times, familiar, unremarkable, while the part of her attention that she'd allocated to the specific purpose of today's visit catalogued what was visible through the kitchen doorway into the main room. The office door was ajar. It had been ajar every Wednesday she'd been here, which was either habit on Calhoun's part, or the passive confidence of a man who saw no reason to close doors in his own house against a neighbor bringing eggs. She could see the desk from the kitchen table. The corner of it, the near edge, the surface holding the usual accumulation of a working desk, papers, a lamp, an inkwell, the specific organized disorder of a man conducting business. and on the near corner of the desk, visible from where she sat without leaning or craning, a leather document case with a brass clasp. She described it to Eldridge from memory. The last time she'd been here, 6 weeks ago, before he arrived, when she'd noted it and written the description in her ledger as a matter of practice, because she'd been noting and writing everything for 2 years as a matter of practice. She described it as brown leather, good quality brass clasp, sitting on the desk's near corner. It was still there. Same position. Same corner. Either it hadn't moved in 6 weeks, or it had moved and been returned to the same place, which in a man like Calhoun was entirely possible. A man who built things to plan, put things back where they lived. Marta was talking about her daughter's husband, who had opinions about the coming child's name that Marta found premature and somewhat presumptuous. And Dessa was listening and responding and laughing at the right moments and drinking her coffee. And the part of her attention on the office door measured the distance between the kitchen table and the desk's near corner and confirmed what she already knew, that she could reach the document case in 4 steps from the kitchen doorway, and that 4 steps was not a thing she was going to take. Not because she hadn't thought about it. She'd thought about it for 6 weeks, since she'd first noted the case and written the description. She'd thought about what was in it, and what it would prove, and what Eldridge could do with it, and what a federal judge in Wichita would do with what Eldridge could do with it. And she'd thought about all of that in the full knowledge that taking it would be theft, and that theft destroyed evidence and handed Calhoun's lawyer exactly the procedural weapon she needed to make everything else inadmissible. And she'd concluded, every time she thought about it, that she wasn't going to take it. She wasn't going to take it. But she was going to look at it. "I need to use your necessary," she said to Marta, in the middle of the conversation about the child's name. "The heat going south this morning." Marta waved her toward the back hallway without interrupting herself, because Marta had been cooking in this house for 2 years, and the location of the necessary was not something that required direction. Dessa stood and walked through the kitchen doorway into the main room. She gave herself 30 seconds. Not because 30 seconds was enough for everything she wanted to know. It wasn't. It was barely enough for any of it. But because 30 seconds was the outer edge of what a woman walking to a necessary could credibly use without it becoming something else. And she'd decided on 30 seconds before she left the North Bank this morning, and she was going to hold to it. The document case first. She crossed to the desk without touching anything else, lifted the case by its edges rather than the clasp, turned it to read the label inset in the leather on its front face, a small card behind a brass frame, handwritten, 2 words, water rights. She set it back, exactly as it had been. Exact position, exact angle, the shadow it cast on the desk surface matching the shadow it had been casting. The desk surface. She read it in the way Eldridge had described reading rooms, not looking for one thing but receiving everything and sorting it. And what she received in the remaining 20 seconds was this: a letter on the desk center, partially drafted, in Calhoun's deliberate hand, addressed to a name she recognized from the land office files, the clerk whose name Eldridge had noted from the Kismet Depot telegram, the name on the Dodge City land office address that R. Case had sent his message to 3 weeks ago. The letter was 2 sentences into its body before a blot had stopped it, and Calhoun had set it aside, the blot dried brown, the pen left beside it. She didn't read the 2 sentences. She read the name at the top, and she read the address, Dodge City Federal Land Office, the specific department. And she walked back through the main room into the hallway and used the necessary, and walked back to the kitchen and sat down and picked up her coffee, and Marta was still talking about her daughter's husband's opinions about names. Dessa laughed at the right moment. Her hand on the coffee cup was entirely steady, which she was aware of with the specific, removed awareness of a person observing themselves from a slight distance, noting the steadiness as something that was being maintained rather than something that simply was. She'd been in that main room. She'd been 4 steps from what she'd been trying to reach for 2 years. She'd looked at it and set it back down and walked away from it, and the walking away from it was the right thing, and she knew it was the right thing, and the knowing of it didn't make the doing of it any easier to be in. She finished her coffee. She thanked Marta for the coffee and collected her empty crates and said she'd be back next Wednesday with more eggs. And Marta thanked her and asked after her health in the specific, warm way of a woman who genuinely wanted to know. And Dessa said she was fine in the specific, warm way of a woman who appreciated being asked. And she drove the wagon north out of the South Fork yard and across the Cimarron and up the rise toward the barn. Eldridge was where she'd left him. Not, she noticed, in the barn, but outside it, standing in the yard's narrow strip of windmill shade with the expression of a man who'd been staying on the north bank as instructed and had found the staying difficult and had not left anyway. She pulled the wagon up and got down and told him what she'd seen in the specific, organized sequence of a woman who'd prepared her account on the drive north and was now delivering it. The document case and its label. The letter and the name on it. The address. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. "You're sure of the name?" he said. "I've read it in your notes," she said. "The name from the Kismet telegram. It's the same name." He looked south toward the Cimarron, toward the South Fork, toward the ranch house with its cool interior, and its document case sitting on the near corner of the desk, and its partially drafted letter with the dried blot stopping at mid-sentence. She watched him think, and said nothing, and the windmill turned its slow circle above them in the heat, and produced its usual insufficient water, and the drought sat on the country the way it had been sitting on it since April, with no particular interest in anyone's plans or timelines or the 30 seconds a woman had given herself in a room she'd needed to be in for 2 years. "The letter," she said. He looked at her. "He's writing to the same name, at the same address," she said. "Whatever he's writing, he was writing it before you went to the South Fork on Thursday. Before your visit." She paused. "He's been corresponding with someone at the land office. Actively. Not just receiving, corresponding." "I know it," Eldridge said. "That's not in the warrant," she said. "The warrant covers the fraud filing. It doesn't cover a compromised federal official." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "Is that a problem?" "It's a different problem," he said. "From a different office. With a different kind of reach." She looked at the Cimarron below the rise, at the thin brown thread of it in the white gravel, at the south bank beyond it with its good fences, and its pump house, and its patient, well-built, thoroughly prepared architecture of a man who had decided what he wanted and had spent 2 years acquiring it through every available mechanism. "How long?" she said. Not a full question. She knew he couldn't answer the full question, and she wasn't asking it entirely. She was asking what she was asking, which was something more like, how much more? 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4. The Wichita ruling. She nodded. She went into the barn and began unloading the empty crates with the same direct, purposeful efficiency she'd loaded them with that morning. And Eldridge helped without being asked, taking the crates from the wagon bed and stacking them against the barn wall. And they worked together in the heat without talking, and the work was what it was, ordinary, physical, the kind of thing that needed doing regardless of everything else, and that occupied the hands while the mind ran what it ran. When the wagon was empty, she unhitched the horse and led it to the stall and forked hay into the bin and Eldridge put the wagon under the lean-to and came back into the barn. The label said water rights, she said from the stall. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the horse taking its hay. I've been thinking about that for 2 years. What the document is. What it looks like. Whether Oren's signature looks like Oren's signature or like something else. She paused. I don't know what I expected. Something dramatic, maybe. Something that would look wrong from across a room. She was quiet. It looked like a document case. It looked like 100 document cases. The examiner in Wichita will know what it looks like from close, Eldridge said. That's the difference. She came out of the stall and latched it and looked at him. I know it, she said. I know all of it. I've known all of it for 2 years. She looked at the barn floor, at the clean-swept hard-packed dirt, at the workbench with its lamp and its ledger, and the horseshoe holding the papers down. I just needed to say it out loud, to somebody who wouldn't tell me it was going to be fine. I won't tell you that, Eldridge said. I know you won't, she said. That's why I said it. She went to the workbench and opened her ledger and found the page she was working on and picked up her pencil. And Eldridge went to the tack room and sat on the edge of his bedroll in the heat. And the barn held them both in its specific, adequate shade. And outside the windmill kept its slow, insufficient circle, and the drought kept its 104 degrees. And 2 miles south the Cimarron ran its thin brown thread, carrying less than the country needed toward wherever diminished rivers went when the rain stopped coming and the summer refused to end. Chapter 7. Sunday came in cooler than the days before it by 10 degrees, which in no man's land in August meant it was still hot, but hot in a way the body could negotiate rather than simply endure. A cloud bank had moved in from the northwest Saturday evening and held through the night, not bringing rain. The clouds in this drought year had long since lost Eldridge's confidence as predictors of rain, but blocking the stars and holding a residual ground moisture that made the pre-dawn air smell briefly like what the country was supposed to smell like in a normal summer. He rode west along the north bank in the dark, the roan moving through it with her ears forward, the specific, attentive posture of a horse in unfamiliar darkness reading the ground ahead with senses better suited to it than her rider's. He found the draw at the third attempt. The first 2 gaps in the cedar break were draws that looked right from the river end, and proved wrong as soon as he rode into them. Too narrow, no clear line to the river mouth, no cedar with a lightning scar on its south side. The third one opened correctly, the cedars parting into a natural corridor that ran south from the break to the riverbank. And at its mouth, a cedar that had been hit at some point in its life by something that had taken a strip of bark from its south face and left the wood beneath it white and exposed, the scar healed at its edges but still clearly readable. He tied the roan inside the draw, in the cedars, where she wasn't visible from the North Bank Road or the river, and walked to the draw's mouth and stood in the dark and waited. Wiley came from the south. He came across the Cimarron, at a shallow crossing Eldridge hadn't known was there, a series of flat limestone shelves that the drought had exposed and that allowed a horse to cross without swimming, stepping stone to stone in the thin current, the sound of it barely audible from the draw's mouth, until Wiley was already on the north bank and leading his horse up through the willow fringe. He came to the cedar and stopped and looked at Eldridge and looked at the draw and at the roan visible in the cedars. You found it, he said. Third try, Eldridge said. Wiley looked at the sky, the cloud bank, the diffuse, lightless dark of an overcast pre-dawn. Rain, maybe, he said, with the specific, suppressed hope of a young man who'd grown up in strip country and knew better than to say it with confidence. Maybe, Eldridge said. Wiley unsaddled his horse and picketed it on a long rope in the grass at the draw's edge, and took the saddle into the cedars and set it against the trunk of the lightning-scarred cedar and opened the saddlebag. He produced the tin box. It was a standard tobacco tin, the kind that came with a hinged lid and a rubber seal, old enough that the lid had lost its original color and gone to the specific dark patina of a tin that had been handled often over many years. He held it for a moment before he opened it. Not hesitation, more the specific pause of a man acknowledging the weight of a thing before he set it down. He opened it and set it on the saddle between them. Inside, a work ledger, cloth-bound, dark blue, its spine showing the wear of regular use. 2 pieces of leather bridle rein, each perhaps 8 inches long, each ending at the bit end in the specific torn, ragged break of leather, snapped under sudden, extreme lateral tension rather than the clean failure of leather that had simply aged past its useful life. A folded document that Eldridge didn't touch yet. A photograph, small, cabinet card size, showing a man of perhaps 50 standing in front of a barn with his hat in his hand. Len Foss, Eldridge supposed, with the Foss Place's barn behind him, the same barn that was now on property bearing Calhoun's brand. Wiley didn't look at the photograph. Eldridge looked at the bridle pieces first. He picked up the left side, the longer of the 2 pieces, a hand's width more than the right, and held it in both hands and examined the break end in the diffuse pre-dawn light. The leather at the break was torn rather than cut. The fibers splayed outward at the point of failure in the specific pattern of material stressed to its limit from the side rather than from below. The break was 6 inches from where the bit ring would have attached, which was close enough to the metal that the leather at the break point was still supple. The bit end of a rein stayed softer longer than the hand end because it didn't receive the oils and wear of a rider's grip. He set it down and picked up the right side. The same break point. The same lateral stress pattern. The same distance from the bit end. The right side had an additional detail the left side didn't. A faint impression in the leather above the break. A compression mark crossing the rein at roughly a right angle to its length. The kind of mark a rope or a strap made when it was pulled tight across a surface under load. He held this for a moment. Then he set it down and picked up the work ledger and opened it to the entry Wiley had described. April 14, 1881. 2 men taken on from the South Fork construction job, their names recorded in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who treated his records as a form of accountability. Len Foss had noted their wages and their start date, and the job they'd been working previously, and the job was recorded as Pump House Foundation, Calhoun, South Fork, began March approximately. He read it twice. He closed the ledger. "The folded paper," Wiley said. Eldridge looked at it in the tin box. "My father wrote it," Wiley said. "A month before he died. He didn't tell me about it. I found it in the tin box when I took it from the barn. I don't know if he intended it as a record of something or just needed to write it out." He looked at the cloud bank above them. "I've read it enough times that I could write it from memory, but I'd rather you read it yourself." Eldridge took the paper from the box and unfolded it. It was 2 pages in the same careful, deliberate hand as the ledger entries, Len Foss writing in the specific register of a man who didn't write for pleasure and understood, therefore, that writing something down meant he'd decided it was worth the effort and the permanence. The first page described a conversation Len had with Calhoun in September of '81, 2 months before Len's death, 2 months after Orrin Galt's drowning, in which Calhoun had proposed the same arrangement he claimed to have been proposed to him by Orrin, a cash payment for the North Fork water rights with a grazing lease attached. Len had written down the specific language Calhoun had used, the figures, and his own response, which was no, stated in the plain Appalachian directness of a man for whom no was a complete sentence. The second page was shorter. It described a second conversation, 2 weeks after the first, in which Calhoun had come back with a revised figure, and Len had again said no, and in which Calhoun had said something that Len had recorded verbatim in quotation marks in the middle of the second page, alone on the line, which was where you put something when you wanted it read, as distinct from the surrounding text. These things have a way of resolving themselves, Len. One way or another. Below the quotation, Len had written, "I am putting this down because I want there to be a record of it if something happens. I don't know that it means what it sounds like. I know I want it written down." Eldridge read the 2 pages and refolded them and put them back in the tin box. He looked at Wiley. Wiley was looking at the cloud bank, which had thickened slightly in the last hour and was beginning to show the lower, darker quality of clouds that were considering their options seriously. "He knew," Wiley said. "He wrote it down because he knew." "He suspected," Eldridge said. "He didn't know. The distinction mattered to him, which is why he wrote, 'I don't know that it means what it sounds like.' He was an honest man, and he held himself to honest language, even when the honest language was less than what he feared." Wiley looked at him. "That's him exactly," he said quietly. "That's exactly who he was." The draw held the silence of the pre-dawn, the cedars around them making their small, dry sound, the roan and Wiley's horse both standing still in the early dark with the composed patience of animals that had been in enough situations requiring waiting to have made their peace with it. "What does it prove?" Wiley said. "All of it. Together." Eldridge thought about this with genuine care, because Wiley deserved a genuine answer rather than an encouraging one, and had the intelligence to know the difference. "The ledger proves the pump house construction timeline," he said. "March of '81. Before any of the rights transfers. Before your father or Orrin Galt signed anything." He paused. "The bridle pieces prove the bridle failed under lateral stress, at the bit end from both sides simultaneously. A horse that throws a rider doesn't break both reins at the bit end from the same direction at the same time. Something pulled Cutter to a stop from the front, both reins, hard enough to snap the leather." He looked at the tin box. "Your father's letter proves he was approached twice with an offer he refused, and that after the second refusal, Calhoun said something your father considered worth putting on paper." "And together," Wiley said. "Together, they build a picture a federal jury can read," Eldridge said. "Not a conviction by themselves. Evidence doesn't convict. Juries convict when evidence gives them enough of a picture that the picture becomes the only reasonable explanation for what they're looking at." He paused. "This, combined with the document case and the original filings once Wichita rules, combined with the pump house timeline from Priscilla Dace's own records, combined with the R-case telegrams, it's a picture." Wiley looked at the tin box. "Will you testify?" Eldridge said. The question sat in the draw between them, with the specific weight of a question that had been forming for 2 years and was now in the air and couldn't be taken back. Wiley looked at the cloud bank. A breath of wind came through the draw from the northwest, cool, carrying the specific smell that the strip country produced when weather was actually building rather than threatening, and retreating as it had been threatening and retreating since April. "If I testify," Wiley said, "Calhoun knows. He'll know before the ink dries on whatever I sign." "Yes," Eldridge said. "Because of the land office," Wiley said. "Because whoever our case reports to at the land office passes it to Calhoun." "Probably," Eldridge said. "Not certainly. I'm working that problem separately. But probably. So testifying puts me in front of the same man who pulled both my father's reins at once on a section road," Wiley said, "and who will know I'm the one who put the bridle pieces in front of a federal jury." "Yes," Eldridge said. He didn't add anything to it, because adding anything would have been the wrong kind of help, the kind that did the work of the decision for the person who needed to make it, which was not help but substitution. And Wiley Foss was 24 years old, and had been carrying the tin box for 2 years and deserved to make the decision himself without someone making it smaller for him. The wind moved through the cedars again, stronger this time, and both horses lifted their heads. "I want to be moved off the South Fork property before I sign anything," Wiley said. "I won't testify from the bunkhouse. I'll testify from somewhere. Calhoun isn't the man who decides whether I eat next week." "That's reasonable," Eldridge said. "I want Desagault to know I'm coming before I come," Wiley said. "I don't want to show up at her place without her knowing." "I'll tell her tonight," Eldridge said. Wiley looked at the tin box. He reached out and closed the lid with the specific, careful motion of a man returning something to a place it had been for a long time and might need to go back to. "Leave it with me for now," Eldridge said. "Don't bring it back to the bunkhouse." Wiley looked at him. "If Calhoun knows the shape of what you have, the tin box is the first thing he looks for," Eldridge said. "Leave it here. In the drawer. I'll come back for it this afternoon." Wiley set the tin box on the ground beside the cedar's root and covered it with his folded saddle blanket and stood and looked at the sky. The cloud bank had dropped another 200 feet while they'd been talking. The smell on the northwest wind was rain, genuine, building, closer than any rain had been since April. "It's going to rain," Wiley said. "Looks like it," Eldridge said. Wiley looked at the cloud bank with the complicated expression of a young man for whom rain meant something different than it had meant 2 years ago, not simply weather but the specific relief of a drought breaking, and the specific reminder that a thing could be withheld for a very long time and then arrive all at once in a way that made the withholding seem, briefly, like preparation rather than punishment. He saddled his horse and crossed back over the limestone shelves in the rising light and went south along the Cimarron's south bank toward the section road, his figure diminishing against the dry grass until the willow fringe took him. Eldridge collected the roan and rode east toward the Pounder boundary, and the first drops of rain came before he'd gone a mile. Not the tentative, apologetic drops of a storm that wasn't committed, but the large, deliberate drops of weather that had made up its mind and was going to follow through, hitting the dry grass and the dry ground and the dry gravel of the riverbank with the specific percussive sound of water reacquainting itself with earth that had been waiting for it. He turned his face up briefly and let the rain hit it. Then he rode on, because the ground had been waiting since April, and he'd been waiting 4 days for Sunday morning, and both kinds of waiting had now produced what they were going to produce, and what came next was different work that didn't benefit from standing in the rain looking at the sky. The roan moved under him at her ground-covering walk, her ears flat against the rain, her opinion of the weather clearly negative, and her willingness to continue forward regardless clearly intact, which was the quality Eldridge had valued most in her from the beginning, and valued more as the country she moved through got harder. The rain came down. The Cimarron rose by 2 inches before noon. Chapter 8. The Wichita ruling came in 22 days. Stamey brought it down from Liberal himself, the Pratt County Sheriff making the 40-mile drive in a rented buggy with the document in his coat pocket, arriving at the Galt place on a Tuesday afternoon, looking like a man who'd been on a hard road in uncertain weather and was glad to have arrived somewhere with a roof. The rain that had started on Sunday had continued intermittently for 4 days before stopping, which was not enough to break the drought, but was enough to remind the country of what breaking would feel like, and the road south of Liberal had absorbed the rain the way drought-hardened ground absorbed it. Badly, the water running off the surface rather than into it, collecting in the low spots on the road and turning them to something between mud and intention. Stamey was, in this context, welcome company. He'd come because Eldridge had asked him to come, not for the execution of the search, which was a federal matter requiring the federal land officer from Dodge rather than a county sheriff from Pratt, but because the situation on the North Bank had developed components that were going to require a county sheriff's authority at some point, and Eldridge had wanted Stamey present and oriented before those components became urgent. He told Stamey about our case over supper in the barn. Stamey listened without interrupting, which Eldridge had come to understand was the specific quality that made Stamey worth bringing. He was a man who received information completely before he responded to it, a habit rare enough in lawmen that Eldridge had noted it the first time he'd sat in Stamey's office. "The land office," Stamey said when Eldridge finished. "Federal corruption. I've sent a separate wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Dodge," Eldridge said. "Not the land office, the Marshal's office directly. Everything I have on case, and the name at the land office he was telegraphing." He looked at his coffee. "That wire went 3 days ago. I haven't heard back." "You think they'll move on it," Stamey said. "I think they'll move on it when they move on it," Eldridge said. "I'm not waiting on it. The warrant we have is enough to execute the search, and the search is what produces the document case, and the document case is what we need before anything else." Stamey looked at Dessa Galt across the workbench. "You've seen it." "I've seen where it sits," she said, "and what the label says, and I've left it exactly where it was." Stamey looked at her for a long moment with the flat, evaluating gaze he'd brought to Verna Atkins's kitchen table in Pratt months ago, the gaze of a man taking accurate measure of someone he hadn't expected. "You walked away from it," he said. "Yes," she said. "In that man's house," he said. "Yes," she said. He drank his coffee and said nothing further about it, which was the right response, and Dessa received it as such. Going back to her ledger without acknowledgement, the conversation closed on its own terms. The federal land officer arrived from Dodge on Wednesday morning. His name was Aurelius Webb. Not a Webb with any relationship to the Calder's Bend Webbs of Eldridge's first case, just a coincidence of surname that Eldridge noted internally and let go. And he was a compact, dry, efficient man of 50 who'd been executing federal warrants in the Western Territories for 20 years and had the specific, seasoned quality of someone for whom the procedural aspects of the work had long since become automatic, freeing his attention for the situational aspects, which were the ones that actually varied. Webb read the Wichita ruling in the barn while Dessa poured coffee, and Stamey looked at the ruling over his shoulder. "It's clean," Webb said. The court rejected Dace's objection on both grounds. The document identification is specific enough, and the warrant's scope is appropriate. He folded the ruling and put it in his document case. "We can execute this morning." "Calhoun knows we're coming," Eldridge said. Webb looked at him. "He's had a contact at the land office since before the warrant was issued," Eldridge said. "I've sent a wire to the marshal's office about it, but I don't know what's been done with the wire. Assume Calhoun was told about the Wichita ruling before this ruling left Wichita." Webb received this with the equanimity of a man who had encountered compromised situations before and had developed over 20 years a working philosophy about them. "Then we go now," he said. "This morning. Not this afternoon." "Now," Eldridge agreed. They rode south for Eldridge, Stamey, Webb, and a deputy Webb had brought from Dodge named Casper Pruitt, who was young and serious and carried himself with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who understood that being young and serious in a field of older and more experienced men required getting the details right every single time. Dessa stayed on the north bank. This had been the subject of a direct conversation the night before, sitting at the workbench, and Dessa had made her position clear. She intended to ride south with them. And Eldridge had made his position equally clear, which was that her presence at the search would give Calhoun's lawyer grounds to argue contamination of the evidence by an interested party, and that Priscilla Dace was too good a lawyer to miss that argument, and too thorough to fail to use it. Dessa had looked at him for a long moment, with the full, level attention she brought to everything. "You're right," she said. "I don't like it." "I know you don't," he said. "I've been working toward this for 2 years," she said. "I want to be in that room." "Being in that room costs you the case," he said. "Being on the North Bank wins it." She'd looked at her ledger and looked back at him. "North Bank," she said. He'd nodded and gone to the tack room, and that had been the whole of the discussion. The South Fork yard was quiet when they came through the gate. Too quiet, the specific, managed quiet of a place that had been told to be quiet. The hands visible at the corrals but not working, the bunkhouse door open, and no one coming out of it, the main house showing a light in the front window despite the morning sun. Calhoun was inside. He'd been told. Priscilla Dace's gray horse was at the hitching post. Eldridge noted this, and noted the light in the front window, and noted the absence of the man who came and went. No unfamiliar horse in the corral, no thin, quiet figure visible anywhere in the yard, and rode to the main house and got down. Calhoun came out before they reached the porch. He came with Dace behind him, document case in hand, and he stood at the porch's edge in the morning sun and looked at the 4 riders with the same pale, steady composure he'd had at every previous encounter. Not a performance of composure, Eldridge had long since concluded, but the genuine article, the specific calm of a man who'd prepared for this moment with the same thoroughness he'd brought to every other aspect of the operation, and had decided that the preparation was sufficient. "Mr. Webb," Calhoun said. He knew Webb's name, which confirmed the land office contact had been thorough. "Mr. Calhoun," Webb said. He produced the Wichita ruling and held it out. "Court has ruled on the document objection. We're here to examine original filings related to the water rights transfers identified in the warrant." Dace took the ruling from Calhoun's hand before Calhoun reached for it, and read it where she stood, her eyes moving through it with the fast, scanning precision of a lawyer reading a document she'd been anticipating, looking for the specific language that would tell her whether her objection had been sustained or overruled, and on which grounds and with what limiting language. She read it to the bottom. She folded it. She handed it back to Webb. "We'll cooperate fully with the examination," she said. Her voice was level and professional and entirely without the performance of defeat, because Priscilla Dace was not a woman who performed things. "The originals are in the office. I'll ask that the examination be conducted with Mr. Webb and Mr. Sample only, in Mr. Calhoun's presence, and that the other officers wait in the yard." Webb looked at Eldridge. "Agreed," Eldridge said. The office was exactly as Dessa had described it. Desk, bookcase, lamp. The organized working surface of a man conducting legitimate business, which it partly was, which had always been the central difficulty of the case. The document case sat on the near corner of the desk where it had been sitting for at least 6 weeks, in the same position Dessa had returned it to, the brass clasp catching the morning light from the window. Calhoun sat in the chair behind the desk, and Dace stood to his left, and Webb stood to Eldridge's right, and the room held the specific, formal quality of a proceeding. Not a court, but the anteroom of one, the place where the evidence that would become the court's business was first formally examined and recorded. Webb opened his own document case and produced a form, an examination record pre-printed, with fields for the date and the identifying information of each document examined and the examining officer's observations. He set it on the desk's edge and produced a pen. "The water rights transfer filings," Webb said. "All original documents related to the transfers identified in the warrant. Galt, Pounder, and Foss parcels, North Fork, Cimarron drainage." Calhoun looked at Dace. Dace opened her document case and removed a folder and set it on the desk in front of Webb. She did this with the clean, professional manner of a lawyer who had examined the contents of the folder beforehand. Eldridge was certain of this, and had made her determination about what she was going to say about them, and was now prepared to say it. "3 original filings," she said, "each with the grantor's signature, the notary's seal, and the filing date. Each consistent with the filed copies in the county recorder's office in all material respects." Webb opened the folder. The documents were there, 3 separate filings, each on the standard federal water rights transfer form, each bearing a signature on the grantor line. Orrin Galt's name in a hand that Eldridge had no way to verify here. August Pounder's name. Len Foss's name, in the careful, deliberate hand that Eldridge recognized from the work ledger and the letter in the tin box. Webb examined each one methodically, holding them to the window light, turning them to read the notary's impression, checking the dates against the form on his examination record. He wrote as he examined, his pen moving in the small, precise script of a man who understood that the examination record was itself a document that would be read later by people who hadn't been in this room. Eldridge watched Calhoun while Webb worked. Calhoun sat behind his desk with his hands folded on its surface, and his pale brown eyes moving between Webb and the documents with the unhurried attention of a man watching a process he'd anticipated. He looked like a man waiting for something to be confirmed, rather than a man waiting for something to be discovered, and the distinction was the one thing in the room that told Eldridge something the room hadn't told him when he'd stood in it on Thursday with the tour. He looked like a man who knew what the documents would show. He looked like a man who decided what they would show a long time ago. Webb set the 3rd document down and looked at Eldridge and gave him a small, specific nod, not a conclusive nod. Not the nod of a man who'd found what he was looking for, but the nod of a man who'd found enough to justify the next step, which was the document examiner in Wichita who would look at the paper and the ink and the impression of the pen and the specific chemistry of the notary's seal and tell a federal court whether what looked genuine was genuine. "I'll need to take these for examination," Webb said to Dace. "They're subject to a chain of custody receipt," Dace said. "Signed by you, witnessed by Mr. Calhoun, returned to us in the same condition following the examination." "Standard procedure," Webb said. He produced a receipt form. Dace read it before she let Calhoun sign it, which was the right thing to do, and the thing Eldridge had expected her to do. And Calhoun signed it, and Webb signed it, and Eldridge witnessed it, and the 3 original documents went into Webb's document case with the chain of custody receipt folded on top of them. It was, to outward appearances, an entirely orderly proceeding. Documents requested, documents produced, documents transferred with proper paperwork. Calhoun stood when Webb closed his document case, which was the signal that the examination was concluded, and extended his hand to Webb in the specific manner of a man completing a transaction with another professional. Webb shook it. Calhoun looked at Eldridge. "Sample," he said. "Calhoun," Eldridge said. "You've been thorough," Calhoun said. "I want to acknowledge that. Most men in your position would have come at this differently." He said this with the genuine, unhurried quality that characterized everything he said, the warmth in it neither performed nor ironically deployed, simply present, the default register of a man who'd spent 50 years being the kind of man other men found reasonable. "I hope the examination produces whatever you're looking for." Eldridge looked at him. "It will," Eldridge said. Something moved behind the pale brown eyes, brief, controlled, gone before it fully formed. Not fear. Not the involuntary response of a guilty man hearing confirmation of his exposure. Something more calculated than that. The specific recalibration of a man updating an assessment of a situation that had just changed its character. He'd heard something in Eldridge's it will that told him Eldridge had more than the documents. Eldridge watched him hear it, and watched him file it, and watched the composure return, complete and smooth, over whatever the filing produced. They walked out of the office into the main room, and out the front door onto the porch, and into the yard where Stamey and Pruitt waited with the horses. Dace followed them to the porch and stopped there. She looked at Eldridge, and in the look was the full, careful attention she'd been bringing to every encounter since the fireplace conversation. The attention of a woman who was doing the work she'd been retained to do, and was watching the work she'd chosen not to do being done by someone else, and was holding both of those things in the professional manner of a person who had made that choice and was living inside it. He gave her a small nod. She gave him nothing visible in return, which was the right response, and the one he'd expected. Stamey had his horse ready. Webb and Pruitt were already mounted. Eldridge swung up and turned the roan north toward the gate, and the four of them rode out of the South Fork yard in the morning sun. At the gate, Eldridge looked back once. Calhoun was still on the porch. He stood in the same position he'd taken when they arrived, at the porch's edge, hands loose at his sides, the pale brown eyes tracking them to the gate with the patient, unhurried attention of a man watching something he'd been watching for a long time and had not yet finished watching. He raised one hand when Eldridge looked back. Not a wave. An acknowledgement. The specific, minimal gesture of a man marking an exchange between two parties who both understood what the exchange was. Eldridge turned the roan north and didn't look back again. At the ford, Stamey pulled alongside him. "He knows it's not just the documents," Stamey said. "He knows," Eldridge said. "That changes tonight," Stamey said. "Yes," Eldridge said. They crossed the Cimarron together, the water higher than it had been since Eldridge arrived. The rain's contribution, modest but real, the river moving with slightly more authority than it had been moving with a week ago, the gravel bars not quite as exposed, the current finding some of what it had lost in the summer. Dessa was at the rise when they came up from the ford, standing outside the barn with her arms folded across her chest in the morning sun, watching them come. The four riders, Webb's document case, the fact of them returning at all, which was the first piece of information she read from a distance before she could read anything else. She read it, and nodded once and went back into the barn. He rode up to the barn, and got down and went in. She was at the workbench, not working, sitting on the stool with her hands in her lap and the ledger closed in front of her, and she looked at him when he came in with the straight, unqualified attention that asked the question without asking it. "Webb has the documents," he said. "Wichita Examiner, within the week." She looked at the closed ledger. "And Calhoun," she said. "Knows it's not just the documents," Eldridge said. "Stamey's right about tonight. I want you in the barn, and I want the barn latched from the inside, and I don't want you to open it for anyone who isn't me or Stamey or Webb." She looked at him. "I've been sleeping in this barn for 6 months," she said. "I know it," he said. "Tonight is different from the other nights." She held his gaze for a moment, with the specific quality that had been present since the first morning, the straight, unqualified attention of a woman who didn't look away from the things she looked at. And then she looked at the barn door and looked at the latch and looked back at him. "All right," she said. Eldridge went to find Stamey. Outside, the cloud bank that had brought the rain was gone, dissolved back into the hard blue drought sky that had been the country's ceiling since April, and the sun hit the yard and the windmill and the rise and the Cimarron below it with the same flat, relentless authority it had been hitting everything with all summer. But the river was higher. Not much. 2 inches, maybe 3. The gravel bars still showing, the current still thin by any standard a normal year set. But higher than it had been yesterday, which was higher than it had been the day before. And in a country that had been watching its water disappear for 4 months, the direction of a thing mattered as much as the size of it. Eldridge looked at the river, and then looked at the south bank, and went to find Stamy. Chapter 9. He spent the afternoon getting ready. Not visibly. He didn't want the preparation to be something Calhoun's contact at the land office could describe to Calhoun if the contact was still active and still watching. And he didn't know whether the contact was still active because he hadn't heard back from the marshal's office in Dodge about the wire he'd sent, which was either because the marshal's office was moving on it quietly or because the wire had been intercepted, and he didn't know which and couldn't find out before dark, and had decided to operate on the assumption that Calhoun knew everything that had happened at the South Fork Ranch that morning, and had been making his own preparations since the gate closed behind them. What he did was move things. He moved Wiley Foss first, rode south to the limestone crossing in the mid-afternoon, alone, and crossed to the south bank, and found a way to the bunkhouse that didn't go through the main yard, through a dry wash that ran behind the second barn, and came up at the bunkhouse's north end. He knocked on the back wall rather than the door. 2 knocks and a pause, and 2 more, which was the signal they'd agreed on when Wiley told him Sunday morning that he'd be at the bunkhouse through the week. Wiley came around the north end of the building in 2 minutes, carrying a bridle he'd been working on, looking like a man doing bunkhouse maintenance in the mid-afternoon. "Now?" Eldridge said. "Not tonight. Now, while it's light, and while it looks like ordinary business." Wiley looked at him. "Pack what you need in your saddlebag," Eldridge said. "Ride north like you're going to check the fence line. You do that regularly." "I do it most afternoons," Wiley said. "Then do it this afternoon," Eldridge said. "Come to the Galt place. Dessa will have a place for you." Wiley looked at the bunkhouse, and looked at the second barn, and looked at the dry wash Eldridge had come up through, and his face held the specific expression of a man standing at a threshold he'd been approaching for 2 years and was now required to cross in the next 30 seconds. "The tin box," he said. "I collected it Sunday afternoon," Eldridge said. "It's at the Galt place. In the tack room." Wiley looked at the bridle in his hands. He turned it once, and then hung it on the bunkhouse wall on a nail that was there for exactly that purpose, the practiced, habitual motion of a man returning something to its place before he left. And he went inside, and came back with his saddlebags over his shoulder in 4 minutes, which was the packing time of a young man who'd been, on some level, packed since Sunday. He saddled his horse at the south end of the corral, away from the main yard, and rode north along the fence line at the pace of a man checking fence, and Eldridge watched him go from the dry wash, and then crossed back at the limestone shelves and rode west along the north bank toward the Galt place. Dessa had a place for him. She showed him the tack room, the one Eldridge wasn't using, and gave him a lamp and a blanket and a plate of food from the barn's cooking setup with the same practical, unsentimental welcome she'd given Eldridge 3 weeks ago, which was not warmth exactly, but was the thing that was better than warmth in a functional sense, competence extended to someone who needed it without requiring them to perform gratitude for the extension. Wiley ate and didn't say much. Eldridge let him not say much. He moved the tin box next. Not far, from the tack room, to a specific place he'd identified in the barn's loft during the first week, a gap between 2 roof beams where the original builder had left a cavity large enough for a tobacco tin, and not large enough for anything that would require routine access. He wrapped it in oilcloth from Dessa's supply shelf, and put it in the cavity, and put a loose board over the cavity, and put 2 bales of hay in front of the board, not blocking it but in the casual arrangement of hay bales that had been moved and not moved back, which was the kind of disorder that looked accidental. He moved the ledger copies Dessa had made separately into the wagon under the seatboard, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the original, because oilcloth was what you used when you wanted something to survive water, and Eldridge had been thinking about water since the Cimarron started rising. He thought about what couldn't be moved and couldn't be duplicated. The original documents were in Webb's custody in Dodge, which was good. The bridle pieces and the work ledger and Len Foss's letter were in the tin box in the loft, which was good. Wiley was on the North Bank, which was good. Dessa's testimony about what she'd seen in the ranch office, the document case label, the letter with the land office name, was in Dessa's head, which was the most defensible location available, and the one Eldridge had no control over and no concerns about. What remained was the Galt place itself, the barn, the house, the rise, the windmill, and the 3 people in it, and whatever Calhoun decided to do about them before the document examiner in Wichita finished his work. Stamey came back from a ride east at 5 o'clock with nothing unusual to report, which Eldridge didn't interpret as reassurance. Webb and Pruitt were in the house. Dessa had opened it for them, having maintained its appearance from the road since February, and the interior showed the specific quality of a house lived in by its furniture rather than its owner, everything in place, nothing personal accumulated, the house performing its function of looking inhabited while Dessa lived 40 feet away in the barn. Eldridge stood in the house's main room and looked at it and thought about the windmill tower with its cut support, the specific premeditated quality of it, the support not broken but cut, not enough to fall immediately but enough to fall certainly when the weather provided the occasion. That was how Calhoun worked. Had worked for 2 years. Through mechanisms that looked like weather and accident and the ordinary attrition of hard country hard living. Not directly. Never directly. The patience was not separate from the method. It was the method, the thing he used instead of the thing a different kind of man would use. Tonight was different. Tonight the documents were in federal custody, and Wiley Foss was on the North Bank, and the pump house timeline was in a federal land officer's examination record, and the Wichita examiner was going to look at the paper and the ink and produce an opinion that a federal judge would read. And all of that together had changed the calculation in a way that 2 years of Dessa's careful, methodical case building hadn't changed it, because Dessa's case building had been building toward a moment that was coming, and Calhoun could always see the moment was coming and had time to manage it. The moment was here. Calhoun was out of time to manage it through patience. What a patient man did when patience ran out was what Eldridge had been thinking about since he rode back across the Cimarron at noon. He'd been thinking about it specifically, and he'd arrived at a specific answer, which was that a patient man who ran out of patience didn't become a reckless man. He became a different kind of patient man, one who was now patient about a different objective, which was limiting damage rather than acquiring position. Limiting damage meant witnesses. Wiley Foss, Dessa Galt, Eldridge himself. 3 people whose testimony and evidence constituted the viable case against him. Eldridge went back to the barn. He told Stamey what he expected at 6 o'clock in the barn, with Dessa at the workbench and Wiley on the tackroom threshold, and Webb and Pruitt leaning against the far wall with the listening posture of men paying attention to a briefing. 2 men, Eldridge said. Not Calhoun himself. Not directly, that's not how he's worked, and tonight isn't the night he changes it. He'll send the man who comes and goes. Cased. Possibly with help, possibly alone. He paused. They'll come after dark. They'll come at the house first, because the house is where a reasonable person would be. Dessa looked up from the ledger. I've been sleeping in the barn for 6 months. Calhoun doesn't know that, Eldridge said. He knows you light the house lamp in the evening. He knows the house looks inhabited from the road. He doesn't know where you actually sleep. She looked at him steadily. The barn. The barn, he said. Which means they come to the house first and find it empty, and then they come to the barn. And the barn is where we want them to come rather than somewhere we have to chase them to. Stamy looked at the barn door. One entrance. Front and the hayloft door above it, Eldridge said. The hayloft door doesn't open from the outside without a ladder, and there's no ladder leaning against the barn. We put one there, Stamy said. No, Eldridge said. We don't advertise the second entrance. We cover it from inside. Stamy looked at the loft. That's Pruitt, he said. Pruitt looked up at the loft and looked at Stamy, and nodded once with the serious, careful attention that had characterized him since Dodge. He was young, but he had the quality of someone who decided what he was doing before he arrived at the place where he had to do it, which was the most useful quality available in a loft in the dark. Webb, Eldridge said. Webb looked at him. I need you somewhere that isn't this barn, Eldridge said. If this goes wrong and the barn goes wrong, the documents in your custody are the only thing left of the case. I need you a mile north, on the Liberal Road with your horse ready. Webb looked at him with the seasoned equanimity of 20 years. I don't like it, he said. I know you don't, Eldridge said. Do it anyway. Webb held his gaze for a moment, and then nodded and began collecting his gear. Dessa looked at Eldridge. And me. Inside, Eldridge said. Latched. Armed. If anyone who isn't me or Stamy gets into this barn, you put them on the floor. She looked at the shotgun on the wall above the workbench, a double-barrel 12-gauge that had been there since Eldridge arrived, and that showed the specific, maintained condition of a firearm that was kept ready rather than kept for occasion. I know how to use it, she said. I know you do, he said. They ate at 7, the 4 of them remaining in the barn, a cold meal that Dessa put together from the barn's provisions without ceremony. And they ate with the focused, economical attention of people who understood that the eating was preparation rather than occasion. Wiley ate and said nothing, which was the right call, and Eldridge didn't push it. After dark, Eldridge moved outside. He went to the north side of the barn first, where the shadow of the barn's wall fell deepest, and sat against it with his back to the adobe, and looked at the yard and the house and the road coming up the rise from the Cimarron Ford, and let his eyes adjust to the dark. Full dark came slowly in August even without the cloud bank, the sky holding the day's heat in a faint luminosity above the horizon that faded by degrees until it was gone and the stars replaced it. Stars tonight. Clear sky. No moon until after midnight. Good dark, in the way that darkness was good when you were the one waiting in it rather than the one moving through it. He heard the Cimarron below the rise, the river's low, continuous sound, higher now than it had been a week ago, and still rising, the upstream rain continuing to arrive in the Cimarron drainage at the pace that distant rain arrived in rivers, slowly and then all at once. He could hear the difference between the river tonight and the river 3 weeks ago when he'd first crossed it, and the difference was real, even if it was still insufficient by any absolute measure. He sat against the barn wall and watched the road and listened. At 9 o'clock, a coyote worked the drainage east of the rise, its voice carrying in the clear night air with the specific, serial quality of a coyote that hadn't found what it was looking for and was revising its search pattern. The sound moved east and then stopped and didn't resume. At 10, a light appeared on the south bank. Briefly. Not a lamp, not a lantern, but the brief orange flare of a match being lit and extinguished, the kind of light a man made when he was checking his position on a dark bank and didn't want the light to carry. Eldridge stood up. He moved to the south corner of the barn where he could see the ford, or where the ford would be visible if the night were lighter, and watched the darkness at the river's edge and listened. The ford was limestone shelves, the same crossing Wiley used on Sunday mornings, which Eldridge had confirmed from Wiley was also the crossing Calhoun's hands used for the fence work on the north pasture, and was therefore a known route and not a discovery. He heard horses in the water. 2 horses, the doubled sound of 2 sets of hooves on wet limestone, careful, slow. Not the sound of men trying to be inaudible, but the sound of men moving at a pace the darkness and the footing required. He went to the barn door. 2, he said through the gap. South. 10 minutes. Stamey's voice from inside, ready. He moved back to the north wall and waited. They came to the house first, as he'd expected. He watched them from the north wall's shadow. 2 shapes in the dark, moving from the rise's edge to the house's porch with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who'd been told what they were doing and were doing it. One of them tried the front door, which Dessa had left unlocked, which Eldridge had suggested she do, because a locked door was a delay, and a delay was noise. The door opened. They went inside. He moved to the barn door. Inside the house a lamp appeared. They'd brought one, which meant they'd come prepared for a house that was dark, which meant someone had told them Dessa was careful about light. And the lamp moved through the house in the visible way of a lamp carried room to room, the light showing and the windows in sequence as they searched it. 2 minutes. The lamp stopped moving. Then it went out. They'd found the house empty and had extinguished the lamp rather than leaving it burning, which was the decision of men operating with discipline. Don't leave evidence of your passage if you don't have to. They came back out the front door and stood on the porch for a moment, 2 shapes in the dark, and one of them looked at the barn. Eldridge went inside the barn. He pulled the door to, not latched, just closed, and went to the right side of the door frame and stood in the dark with his back to the wall and the colt in his hand, and let his eyes work with what light the cracks in the barn siding offered. Dessa was at the workbench. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there by the specific quality of stillness she produced when she was managing herself, which was different from the stillness of an empty room. Pruitt was in the loft, silent. Stamey was at the left side of the door frame. The barn was quiet. Outside, footsteps on the hard-packed yard, 2 sets coming toward the barn. They came without speaking, which confirmed the discipline, and stopped at the barn door. A pause. Then the door opened. The first man came in with a lantern he lit in the doorway before he stepped through, which was a tactical error. The lit lantern put his face in light before his eyes had adjusted to the barn's interior, and Eldridge could see him clearly before he could see anything clearly. And what Eldridge saw was a thin man of 40 or so with a quiet face and the specific, contained stillness of someone who did this kind of work regularly and had developed the composure that regular work produced. Cased. The second man came in behind him, larger, moving with less economy, and had started to fan out to the right when Stamey said from the left side of the doorframe, "Stop where you are." Both men stopped. "Hands," Eldridge said from the right. Cased turned his head toward Eldridge's voice with the controlled, unhurried motion of a man processing a situation rather than reacting to it, which was the specific quality that made him more dangerous than the larger man. And Eldridge watched his hands and watched his eyes and kept the colt level at the center of him. "Hands," Eldridge said again. Cased raised them. The larger man raised his, a half-second later, looking between Stamey and Eldridge with the expression of a man calculating odds that weren't improving with examination. From the loft, Pruitt said, "I've got the loft door." Neither man looked up, which was the disciplined response, and confirmed what Eldridge had understood about Kaysk from the Kismet livery ledger and the depot telegram. A professional working a job, aware that the job had developed complications. Dessa came out of the dark at the back of the barn and crossed the barn to the lantern Kaysk had set on the floor in the doorway, and picked it up and held it without pointing the shotgun at anyone, because she didn't need to point it to communicate that she had it. Kaysk looked at her. She looked back at him with the straight, unqualified attention she brought to everything. And in the lantern light her face was the face it had been since the first morning, specific, particular, worn by 2 years of this, and not broken by them. "Birch," Eldridge said. Stamey came forward with the irons. They put Kaysk and the larger man, who gave his name when Stamey asked, as Dolan Marsh, no relation to Ottilia Marsh of Cedar Wash, just a man who'd done work for hire in the strip country for 3 years and had finally done work for hire that had consequences, in the tack room that Wiley had vacated, with the door latched from the outside, and Pruitt sitting in front of it. And they sat in the barn in the lamplight, and Stamey wrote down what he needed to write down. Kaysk didn't talk. Dolan Marsh talked enough for both of them, in the specific way of a man who understood that the size of what he'd just been caught doing required a strategic response, and that cooperation was the most strategic response available. He gave Stamey names and dates, and the specific arrangements by which he'd been engaged. And the name he gave as the engaging party was Reuben Calhane, delivered without hesitation, in the flat, factual tone of a man cutting a line he'd already decided to cut. Stamey wrote it down. Dessa sat at the workbench, through all of it, with her hands folded on the closed ledger, and the shotgun on the bench beside her hands, and the expression of a woman who had been building toward a night like this for 2 years and was now in it, and was finding it both more and less than she'd imagined, which was the way that long-anticipated things always arrived, on their own terms rather than on the terms of the anticipation. Eldridge sat on the stool across from her and looked at the barn floor. He thought about Reuben Calhane on the South Fork, in the dark, in his cool adobe house, waiting for what waiting had always produced for him, the resolution of a problem through the mechanism of other men doing other things at his direction, while he maintained the composure of a man with nothing to explain. He thought about what Calhane would do when neither Kaysk nor Marsh came back. He thought about first light. Outside, the Cimarron ran its ongoing conversation with its own banks, higher now than it had been the day before, the rain's contribution arriving in increments that were individually insufficient and collectively significant, and the sound of it carried up the rise and through the barn siding in the low, continuous way that rivers carried, steadily, without marking its own passage, simply present and moving in the direction rivers moved, which was always the same direction regardless of what happened on the banks. Dessa looked at the barn door. "First light," she said. Not a question. "First light," Eldridge said. She nodded, and opened her ledger and picked up her pencil, and he sat on the stool and watched the barn door, and let the night move toward morning, at the rate that nights moved, which was steady and indifferent, and not subject to the preferences of the people waiting inside it. Chapter 10. He rode south before the sky was fully light. Not because first light was a deadline he'd assigned arbitrarily. It was the specific deadline that a man who'd sent 2 people into a barn and gotten back neither of them would assign to whatever came next. And the whatever that came next in Calhane's case was either running or not running. And the 12 hours of dark since the barn had been time enough for him to have decided which, and to have acted on the decision, if running was what he'd decided. Stamey came south with him. They left Pruitt with Case and Marsh in the tack room, and Webb, who'd come back at midnight when Eldridge sent word north on the Liberal Road, watching the barn's exterior. And they left Dessa at the workbench with her ledger and the shotgun and the lamp burning, because Dessa was going to be exactly where she was going to be, and there was nothing Eldridge had to say about it that she hadn't already incorporated into her own accounting. They crossed the Cimarron at the ford. The ford was different this morning. The limestone shelves still visible, but narrower. The water running over the edges of them rather than alongside them. The current with a presence and a weight it hadn't had a week ago. Not flooding. Not high water in the dangerous sense. But real water, purposeful. The Cimarron behaving like a river rather than like the memory of one, which was what it had been for 4 months. Eldridge let the roan find the shelves herself, and she found them careful and accurate, stepping with the deliberate confidence of a horse that trusted her footing and trusted the rider giving her the rein to use it. They came up the south bank in the gray pre-dawn light. The South Fork road was empty. The yard was wrong from the gate. He read it in the sequence that yards communicated their condition to someone who knew how to read them. The gate standing fully open, not the partial open of a working morning when hands moved equipment through it, but the wide, unattended open of a gate left by someone who'd gone through it last and hadn't thought about closing it behind them. The corral empty of all but 2 horses, the working horses, the horses that belonged to the property rather than to the men who lived on it. The bunkhouse with its door closed, which at first light in August was the closed door of a bunkhouse whose inhabitants were asleep or gone, and there were no lamps in the bunkhouse windows. The main house was dark. Stamey rode to the bunkhouse and got down and knocked on the door and waited. A man opened it, one of the regular hands, a large, slow-waking man named Gibbons who Eldridge had seen twice during the property tour, and who looked now like a man dragged from sleep by a knock he'd been hoping not to hear. "Calhoun," Stamey said. Gibbons looked at Stamey, and looked at Eldridge on the roan at the bunkhouse's edge, and rubbed his face with both hands. "Gone," he said. "He rode out around midnight. He didn't say anything to anybody. His horse is gone, and his good rifle, and the money he keeps in the desk, which I only know about because I saw him go to the desk before he went to the barn for the horse. He looked at the yard. He rode west." Stamey looked at Eldridge. "West?" "The same direction Case always rode when he left the South Fork. The main road north toward Liberal, and then west on the Hugoton Road, the road that connected the Strip to the rest of the country, the road to Kismet and the towns beyond it, and the railroad connections beyond those towns that led to the rest of the continent." Calhoun had waited as long as his patience held, and then he'd run, which was the one thing Eldridge hadn't fully predicted, because Calhoun had not run in 2 years of building his operation, and Eldridge had begun to think of the not running as structural rather than strategic. It was strategic. The patience was strategic. And when the strategy failed, the strategic man didn't maintain the patience, he moved. "How long?" Eldridge said to Gibbons. "Midnight," Gibbons said. "Call it 6 hours. 6 hours on the Hugoton Road west put him past Kismet before first light. Past the second town before sunrise. At the third town, which sat at the junction of the Hugoton Road and the freight road north, Calhoun had access to the same railroad connections that anyone at that junction had access to, which was the Santa Fe line running west toward Colorado and the Atchison running east toward Kansas City. 6 hours was a significant head start. Eldridge looked at the empty corral and the open gate and the dark main house and thought about 2 years of patience exhausted in a single midnight ride, and thought about what it said about a man that the running looked like this, not panicked, not disorganized, not the flight of a man caught off guard, but the clean, pre-planned departure of a man who'd maintained a contingency for exactly this moment alongside the patience that had made the contingency unnecessary until it wasn't. He'd always known the patience might not be sufficient. He'd planned for that too. Eldridge touched the roan west. He didn't push her in the dark. The Hugoton Road west of the Cimarron ran through open table country that in daylight was fast ground and in pre-dawn was manageable, and he rode at the pace the light allowed and let the light build, and when it had built enough he pushed her, and she responded with the ground-covering acceleration of a horse that had been held to a measured pace and was glad to be released from it. Stamy fell behind within the first mile. His horse was solid but not the roan, and he'd known it when they turned west, and he hadn't said anything about it because there was nothing to say that wasn't already understood between them. Eldridge rode. The country opened around him in the early light in the specific way that flat country opened at dawn, not revealing itself gradually the way country with topography did, but arriving all at once, the full expanse of it suddenly present in the first light as if it had always been there, and the dark had simply been a bureaucratic formality. Kismet first. He pushed through it without stopping. The livery, the hotel, the depot, all of them shut in the early morning, Anderson's horses in their stalls, no gray gelding with no brand among them, which meant Calhoun hadn't stopped here or had passed through in the night without stopping, the latter being the more likely account of a man with 6 hours led and a destination he'd already chosen. The second town, 12 miles further. The same result. A town waking to its morning business, no gray gelding at the livery or the hotel, and the liveryman, who was already at work at 6 in the morning, because liverymen in small towns were the first ones up and the last ones down, who confirmed that a man on a gray horse had ridden through around 3 in the morning without stopping. 3 in the morning. 3 hours ahead. He pushed the roan harder. The junction town was Haskell, a larger settlement than Kismet or the second town, sitting at the crossroads of the Hugoton Road and the freight road north, with the specific commercial confidence of a place that understood its geography and had built accordingly. A substantial depot, a hotel that aspired to the word, 3 saloons, a livery that operated 2 shifts. He came into Haskell at 7:30 in the morning. The depot first. The Santa Fe schedule board showed a westbound that had departed at 6:45, which was the departure a man who'd left the Cimarron at midnight and pushed his horse would arrive in time to catch, arriving at the depot at 6:30 or so, boarding with 20 minutes to spare, and his gray gelding in the stock car, and the Kansas strip country dropping away behind him toward Colorado. The depot agent confirmed a man matching Calhoun's description had bought a westbound ticket at 6:20. Eldridge stood at the depot's window and looked at the westbound tracks running out of Haskell toward the horizon, toward Colorado, and thought about a man sitting in a Santa Fe car watching Kansas go flat and dry behind him. The patience finally and completely spent. The operation left behind in the specific way you left behind things you decided were no longer worth defending. He thought about what was left behind. The document case in Webb's custody. The original filings, going to the Wichita Examiner. Dolan Marsh talking to Stamy in the tack room at the Galt place. Case in the same tack room, not talking, which was its own form of accounting. Wiley Foss's tin box in the barn loft. Len Foss's letter in its oilcloth. The work ledger with its April 14th entry. The pump house on the South Bank Foundation. Sitting on the river it had been built to control. The river running higher today than yesterday. Priscilla Dace in Liberal, with the Wichita ruling in her hand. The federal marshal's office in Dodge, with Eldridge's wire about our case and the land office name, sitting in a file somewhere, waiting on whatever the marshal's office did with wires it received from bounty men working federal warrant cases in the strip country. He thought about all of it, and then he went to the telegraph office in the Haskell Depot, and sent a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Pueblo, Colorado, which was the first federal authority west of the Kansas line with jurisdiction over a man who'd boarded a westbound Santa Fe at 6:45 from Haskell, carrying a good rifle and the money from his desk, and the specific, depleted patience of someone who'd run out of the one weapon he'd trusted most. The wire said, Reuben Calhane Federal Fraud Warrant Pettis County Stop Westbound Santa Fe, X Haskell, KS 6:45 a.m. Stop Gray Horse Stock Car Stop Hold for Eldridge Sample Stop. He paid the depot agent and went back outside. Stamey arrived 20 minutes later, his horse blowing moderately, having pushed him past what was comfortable in the interest of arriving before Eldridge had made all available decisions without him. He pulled up and looked at Eldridge and looked at the westbound tracks. Santa Fe, Eldridge said. 6:45. I've wired Pueblo. Stamey looked at the tracks for a moment. How far back is Pueblo? He said. Far enough that the wire gets there before he does, Eldridge said. The Santa Fe makes 4 stops. Unless he gets off before Pueblo, which he might, which is why I need you to wire the marshal's offices at each stop. He gave Stamey the stop names, which he'd gotten from the depot agent, along with the schedule. Each office the same wire. Hold him. Stamey took out his own notebook and wrote the stop names down and looked at the list. And you? He said. I'm going to Pueblo, Eldridge said. Stamey looked at him. There's an eastbound this afternoon, he said. But that's not the train, Eldridge said. The roan. Stamey looked at the roan. The roan looked back at him with the dark, even eyes of a horse that had covered the Cimarron drainage and the Hugoton Road west and 30 miles of pre-dawn Kansas at a pace that had left a good horse 12 miles behind. And that was standing at a Haskell depot in the August morning with the specific, contained readiness of an animal that was tired and was not done. That's a long ride, Stamey said. It's a long warrant, Eldridge said. He rode west out of Haskell on the freight road that paralleled the Santa Fe line, the tracks visible to his south in the flat country, running straight and parallel to the horizon in the specific geometry that railroads imposed on land that was amenable to geometry which this land was. He rode all of that day. He stopped twice, once at noon at a stock tank beside the road where he watered the roan for 20 minutes and ate what he had and watered her again, and once at mid-afternoon at a small ranch where a woman sold him bread and a hatful of grain for the horse without curiosity, her questions confined to the weather and the grass condition on the road east, which she asked because she cared about the weather and the grass condition and not because she cared about a man on a horse going west. The land changed through the day. Kansas, going from the flat table country of the Strip to the slightly more varied country above the Arkansas drainage, still dry, still drought-stricken, but with a different quality to the dryness, less the absence of water than the specific character of semi-arid country that was adapted to limited water and was simply experiencing the lower end of its normal range rather than, like the Strip, experiencing something genuinely outside the range it had been built for. He thought about water and the people who needed it, and the people who used that need as a mechanism. He thought about a pump house on the South Fork of the Cimarron, and the specific month it had been built, and what the month said about the mind that had decided to build it. He thought about Dessa Galt sleeping in her barn for 6 months, and the 30 seconds she'd given herself in a room she'd needed to be in for 2 years, and what she'd looked at, and what she'd set back down, and what both of those things said about her. He rode. He reached Pueblo on the morning of the second day. He'd camped one night on the Arkansas, which was running full in Colorado, in a way the Cimarron's tributary system was only beginning to approximate, and he'd slept 4 hours and watered the roan and ridden on before first light, and he came into Pueblo in the early morning of the following day with the roan tired in a way he hadn't pushed her to before. Genuinely tired, the tiredness of a good horse that had given everything it had across 2 days and was still forward because that was her character, but tired. He took her to the first livery he found and told the liveryman what she needed, which was water and grain and rest in that order. And the liveryman looked at her and said he'd see to it, and Eldridge believed him because the man handled her correctly from the first touch, and horses communicated their assessment of handlers in the first 10 seconds. The Pueblo marshal's office was on the main street. The marshal was a compact, competent man named Aurelio Brask, who had the seasoned, unflappable quality of a man who'd been receiving wires about incoming federal fugitives for long enough that receiving them had become a normal condition of the work rather than an exceptional one. He confirmed receipt of Eldridge's wire and Stamey's supplemental wires from the 4-stop towns on the Santa Fe schedule. He got off at the 3rd stop, Brask said. Not Pueblo. Trinidad. Trinidad. 40 miles south. At the base of Raton Pass, the specific geography of a man who'd been on a train and had decided that staying on the train was less useful than getting off before the train arrived at the place the wires were waiting for him. He's been told, Eldridge said. Brask looked at him. Seems like it. The land office contact. The same mechanism that had told Calhoun about the warrant before it cleared the office, that had received Caskey's telegram reporting Eldridge's arrival, that had been corresponding with Calhoun through the partially drafted letter on the ranch office desk. Whether the contact had been rolled up by the marshal's office after Eldridge's wire from the strip or was still active was a question Eldridge had sent to Dodge and hadn't gotten back, and the answer to it was relevant to whether the wires about Pueblo had been read by someone who'd passed the information south to a man on a train with enough time to get off before the train arrived. Trinidad, Eldridge said. My jurisdiction runs to the county line, Brask said. Trinidad is Los Animas County. He was already writing a wire. I'll send to the Los Animas sheriff. He paused. You're going. I'm going, Eldridge said. Brask looked up from the wire. Your horse needs 2 days, he said. You know that. I know it, Eldridge said. The Santa Fe runs a southbound to Trinidad at noon, Brask said. You and your horse can both be on it. Eldridge looked at the clock on the marshal's office wall. 2 hours. Book 2 places, he said. 1 passenger, 1 stock. Trinidad sat at the base of the Raton Pass in the specific geography of a mountain gateway town. Everything oriented toward the pass. The commerce organized around the fact of the pass. The people in it, either coming from the pass or going toward it, or servicing the people doing both. It was a bigger town than anything on the Cimarron Strip, with the specific cosmopolitan quality of a place that processed a great deal of transient traffic and had developed a certain practiced neutrality about who the traffic consisted of. The Los Animas sheriff was a tall man named Cordell Prudhomme, who'd received Brask's wire and who had the wariness of a man who'd been told a federal fugitive had possibly come off a train in his town and was working out what he thought about that. Gray horse, Prudhomme said. No brand. He sold it. Where? Eldridge said. Livery on the south end, Prudhomme said. Man came in 2 days ago with a gray gelding and sold it outright, didn't dicker, took what the liveryman offered, which was less than it was worth, and walked out. He looked at Eldridge. The liveryman said he had the look of a man who'd been on a horse for a long time before the horse got on the train. He was, Eldridge said. He rode the Cimarron Strip to Haskell the night before he boarded. Prudhomme absorbed this. The pass road, Eldridge said. North or south? Could be either, Prudhomme said. North is New Mexico. South is back into Colorado, the long way around. He paused. Or he's still in Trinidad, which is a thing some people do when they're moving. They move fast to a place, and then they stop and let the fast-moving work for them, because everyone chasing them expects them to keep moving. Eldridge thought about a man who'd been patient for 2 years. A man who'd run at midnight and bought a train ticket to Pueblo and gotten off before Pueblo and sold his horse in Trinidad and was now in a town at the base of a mountain pass with 2 roads out and a third option, which was staying, which was what a patient man would do when running had reached the end of its immediate utility. He's staying. Hotels, Eldridge said. 4 of them, Prudhomme said. He was already reaching for his hat. They found him at the 3rd hotel. He'd registered under a different name. Not Calhoun. Not anything that connected to anything. Just a name, 2 syllables, the kind of name that landed in a hotel register without catching. And he'd taken a room on the 2nd floor facing the pass road, which was the room of a man who wanted to see the road before anyone on the road saw him. Prudhomme knocked. A pause. Then Calhoun's voice, even and unhurried, from the other side of the door. "Come in," he said. Which was not what a man said who didn't know who was on the other side of his door, and which told Eldridge, his hand on the door frame, that Calhoun had been watching the street and had seen them come into the hotel and had made a decision about what came next before they knocked. He opened the door. Calhoun was sitting in the room's single chair by the window, exactly as he'd been at the chair by the fireplace in the South Fork ranch house. Upright, composed, the pale brown eyes taking in Eldridge and Prudhomme with the same measured, unhurried attention they'd brought to everything. He'd shaved that morning. His clothes were clean. The room showed the specific order of someone who'd arrived with a bag and had unpacked it into the bureau and hung his coat on the hook behind the door, because unpacking was what you did when you intended to stay somewhere rather than run from it. The good rifle was in the corner, leaning against the wall, unloaded. Eldridge could see the empty chamber from the door. "Sample," Calhoun said. "Calhoun," Eldridge said. "You made good time," Calhoun said. "The roan." "She's at the livery," Eldridge said. Calhoun looked at the window, at the pass road visible through it, at the mountains above the town that were the specific mountains of the Raton Pass, enormous and indifferent, and thoroughly indifferent to everything that happened between them. "I want to tell you something," Calhoun said. "Before this proceeds, however it proceeds." He looked at Eldridge directly. "I built something real on the Cimarron. The infrastructure, the operation, it was real work, done well, and it would have been genuinely useful to that country in the years ahead." He said this without the warmth he deployed in previous conversations, without the performance of reasonableness, without the managed presentation. Just the flat, plain statement of a man who decided, alone in a hotel room at the base of a mountain pass for 2 days, what he was going to say when the time came to say it. The methods were wrong. I'm not telling you they weren't. I'm telling you, the thing I built with the methods wasn't nothing. Eldridge looked at him. He thought about Orrin Galt, in the Cimarron, at the bend below the old cottonwood. He thought about August Pounder in his pasture 2 yards from a prickly pear stand he'd been walking around for 14 years. He thought about Len Foss on the section road with both bridle reins snapped at the bit end from the same direction simultaneously, and the horse that had come home without him, and the boy who'd kept the bridle pieces in a tin box for 2 years because he knew what they meant and didn't know who to give them to. He thought about Dessa Galt in a barn for 6 months. He said nothing. Calhoun looked at the window for a moment longer, and then he stood from the chair and turned around and put his hands behind his back and the composure in the gesture was the composure of a man who decided that the patience was finished, and whatever came after it was something he'd face with the same quality he'd brought to everything else, which was the only thing left to him. Prudhomme put the irons on. They rode the Santa Fe north to Pueblo together. Calhoun and Eldridge and Prudhomme in the same car, the roan in the stock car, the mountains dropping away south as the train climbed to the pass and then began to descend. Calhoun sat across from Eldridge and looked at the country going past the window with the specific, sustained attention of a man who understood he was looking at it for the last time in this particular way, which was free and moving and unrestricted, and who had decided to look at it fully rather than not look at it. Eldridge let him look. He thought about the Wichita document examiner, who would find what he found in the original filings, and about Dolan Marsh talking to Stamey in the tack room, and about the federal marshal's office, and what they'd done or not done with the wire about R. Case and the land office name, and about Priscilla Dace in Liberal with the specific knowledge she'd chosen to maintain, and the specific knowledge she'd chosen not to maintain, and the line between those two choices that she'd drawn and held. He thought about Wiley Foss at the Galt place. He thought about the tin box in the barn loft, and what it held, and what a federal court in Wichita would do with what it held alongside everything else. He thought about Dessa Galt at her workbench with her ledger, the lamp burning, the horseshoe holding her papers down. 2 years of careful, methodical, unassisted work, sitting in the pages of a cloth-bound book that she'd built one entry at a time in the specific way that a person built something when they decided it needed building and no one else was going to build it. He thought about the Cimarron, running higher this morning than yesterday, higher yesterday than the day before. The rain arriving in increments that were individually insufficient and collectively significant. The river finding its way back to itself by degrees, the way rivers did when the conditions that had reduced them finally shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, in the direction rivers always moved, which was the same direction regardless of the season or the drought or the men on the banks arguing about who owned the right to what ran through it. Brask met the train in Pueblo and took custody of Calhoun with the same competent, unhurried efficiency he brought to everything in his office. And Eldridge gave him the full account in writing, 2 pages in his small, careful hand, covering the Trinidad Hotel and the rifle in the corner and the irons and the train north, with Prudhomme's name and jurisdiction noted for the chain of custody record. He went back to the livery and looked at the roan. She'd had 2 days of rest and grain, and the specific, restorative attention of a liveryman who handled her correctly. And she looked like a horse that was ready to go, but also like a horse that had opinions about the pace at which the going would occur, which were the same opinions she always had and that Eldridge always respected. He saddled her and put his saddlebag across her and stood in the livery door. The morning was clear and cool. Colorado above the pass country had a different quality of air than the Kansas Strip, the altitude doing something to it that the Strip's flatness couldn't produce. And after 3 weeks of Strip country heat, it landed on Eldridge's face like a different season. He thought about riding north. He thought about the Cimarron drainage and the North Bank and the Galt place on the rise. And he thought about the work that was finished and the work that wasn't his to finish, the Wichita court, the document examiner, the federal marshal's investigation into the land office contact, the Los Animas County attorney's accounting of Dolan Marsh, the question of what the court ultimately made of the original filings and the pump house timeline, and Len Foss's letter and Wiley Foss's 2 years of careful keeping. Not his to finish. His to deliver, which he'd done. His to account for, which he'd done. The rest belonged to the courts, and the attorneys, and the specific, imperfect mechanisms by which the law processed what the work produced, which were mechanisms Eldridge had long since stopped trying to control, and had learned instead to deliver things to cleanly so that the mechanisms had what they needed to work with. He mounted the roan. She moved out of the livery into the Pueblo morning with the even, ground-covering walk that had carried him from the Cimarron to Haskell, to Pueblo, to Trinidad, and back, the walk that was her natural argument for continuity, for the next mile following from this one without drama or announcement. He turned her north. Not the train. The road, the long road north through Colorado, and back into Kansas, back through the strip country and the Cimarron drainage, and the ford where the limestone shelves were deeper underwater now than they'd been when he first crossed them, back to the north bank and the rise and the barn and the workbench with its ledger and its lamp. He had a warrant to close out with Stamey. He had a chain of custody record to complete with Webb. He had a conversation with Dessa Galt that he hadn't had yet. Not the conversation of the job. Those had all been had, but the one that came after. The one in which a person who'd been living in the same direction for 2 years registered that the direction had changed and worked out what the change meant. He owed her that conversation. Not to tell her anything she didn't know. She would know most of it before he arrived, because Stamey would have wired Liberal and Liberal would have passed it south, but to be present for it, which was different from telling. He owed Wiley Foss a conversation too, though what Wiley needed more than conversation was time, and time was the one thing Eldridge couldn't provide directly and could only stop obstructing. The roan moved north on the Colorado road in the morning cool, her stride opening into the familiar rhythm of distance undertaken without urgency, and the mountains fell away behind them, and the land opened and flattened toward the Kansas line, and the air changed by degrees back toward the quality of strip country air, dry and direct and without the altitude's softening influence. He rode and let the miles come. Somewhere south and east of him, on a train, or in a federal holding facility, or in transit between the two, Reuben Calhoun was in the last stages of the patience that had been his primary instrument for 2 years. The patience finally turned on himself rather than on the situation, because patience turned on yourself was the only thing left when you'd run out of situations to be patient about. Somewhere north of him, on the Liberal Road, the Wichita ruling was in a federal court file alongside the document examiner's pending report, and Dolan Marsh's statement, and Eldridge's own account, and the chain of custody records for the original filings. Somewhere on the north bank of the Cimarron, in a barn on a rise, a woman was at a workbench with a ledger she'd been building for 2 years, and the ledger was finished now, complete, delivered, done. And she was either still writing in it out of the habit that had kept her writing in it when writing in it was the only available action, or she had closed it. And the closing of it was its own kind of accounting that Eldridge couldn't observe from a Colorado road but could understand because he'd been closing ledgers of one kind or another for 20 years and knew what the closing felt like from the inside. He rode north. The roan's shoes rang on a stretch of hardpan and went quiet again on the dirt, and the Kansas line appeared on the horizon in the way that flat country announced its transitions, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the gradual accumulation of the specific qualities that made one piece of country different from the piece before it, until suddenly it was a different country, and the difference was total, and the transition point was somewhere behind you, unmarkable, already past. He crossed it and rode south and east. The Cimarron was running when he reached it, genuinely running, not the thin, effortful thread it had been when he first forded it 3 weeks ago, but a real river, a river with current and purpose and the specific sound that water made when it had found its volume again and was moving with it rather than despite the lack of it. He sat the roan on the north bank for a moment and looked at it. Higher than it had been, the morning of the search. Higher than it had been the morning after the rain. The limestone shelves at the ford, still usable but submerged. The water over them clear enough to show them beneath the surface. The crossing requiring more commitment than it had required 3 weeks ago. He crossed. The water came to the roan's knees, and then her belly, and then dropped again as the shelves rose on the far side, and she moved through it with the reliable, confident competence that had characterized her from the Merrimack to the Sandhills to the Arkansas to here, this ford, this river, this specific morning, in the last days of an August that had been trying to kill the strip country and had not entirely succeeded. He came up the south bank and turned north toward the rise. The Galt place sat against the morning sky as it had sat since before he arrived. The house, the barn, the windmill turning in a real wind today. Not the insufficient trickle of the drought weeks, but a genuine south wind that moved the blades at the pace they were designed to move, and produced from them the sound they were designed to produce, which was the sound of water being lifted from the ground against its own inclination. He rode up the rise. Dessa came out of the barn when he came through the gate. Not running, not hurrying. Moving at the same direct, purposeful pace, she moved at everything, wiping her hands on a cloth that she tucked into her belt as she came. And she looked at him on the roan, and looked at what was visible in his face, and read what she read in it with the same straight, unqualified attention she'd brought to everything since the first morning. She looked at him for a long moment. "Trinidad," he said. "Prudhomme's custody. I wired Stamy from Pueblo." She nodded once. She looked at the roan, who was standing in the yard with the contained, residual energy of a horse that had covered a great deal of ground, and was back in a yard she recognized, and had strong opinions about what should happen next. "She needs water," Dessa said. "She needs water," Eldridge agreed. Dessa took the roan's reins and led her toward the trough at the yard's east edge, and the roan went with her at the steady, trusting pace of an animal being led by someone who handled her correctly. And Eldridge got down and stood in the yard, and felt the south wind on his face, and listened to the windmill above him working in it. The Cimarron was audible from the rise today, in a way it hadn't been when he arrived. The water finding its voice again, the sound of it carrying up through the dry grass of the bank, and across the flat, and up the rise to the yard, the low, continuous, self-assured sound of a river that had remembered what it was. Dessa stood at the trough with the roan, and looked south toward the river, and said nothing. And Eldridge stood in the yard, and let the south wind do what it was doing, and said nothing. And the windmill turned above them both, and the water came up. The end.